The courtroom stretched out before her like a hollow cathedral, its air frigid and sterile, steeped in the sharp tang of polished wood and the lingering bitterness of stale coffee grounds. Shadows danced faintly across the walls, cast by the weak morning light struggling to pierce the thick gray clouds outside. The space buzzed with a restless undercurrent. Soft murmurs from lawyers flipping through case files, clerks shuffling papers with mechanical precision, and spectators shifting uncomfortably in their seats, their eyes darting toward the bench as they awaited the next call to order. The marble floors gleamed under the harsh fluorescent glow, reflecting the tension that hung heavy, almost palpable in the room. Then, in an instant, everything changed. A moment so visceral, so unapologetically cruel, that it sucked the air from the lungs of everyone present, leaving behind a stunned, suffocating silence. She had barely lowered herself into the cushioned chair, one marked with a small brass plaque that read, "Reserved for VIP guests." It was a seat meant for dignitaries, for the influential figures who swept into trials like this one with an air of detached importance. Her fingers had just brushed the armrest, her body still settling, when a thunderous force slammed into her side, a heavy, unforgiving boot that sent her crashing to the ground. The impact reverberated through the room, a sickening thud against the pristine marble that seemed to linger in the air. Papers she'd been holding fluttered down around her like fallen leaves, scattering in chaotic disarray. A collective gasp erupted from the crowd, sharp and jagged, but it couldn't drown out the voice that followed, dripping with venom and contempt. "Get the hell out of that seat, lady. This ain't for your kind." The words cut through the silence like a blade, each syllable laced with disgust. She lay there for a heartbeat, dazed, the world tilting as pain bloomed hot and fierce along her ribs. Her breath hitched, shallow and unsteady, as she blinked up at the blurred faces staring down at her. Some gaped in wide-eyed horror, mouths open but silent. Others sat rigid, their expressions frozen in a mixture of fear and apathy, unwilling, or perhaps unable, to act. Above her loomed the man who had struck her, his presence towering and oppressive. He wasn't just anyone. He was a cop, a white cop, built like a wall of muscle, his uniform pressed to crisp perfection, his badge catching the light with a cold, mocking glint. His eyes bore into her, dark and unyielding, filled with a twisted certainty that no one would dare defy him. To him, she was nothing, less than nothing, and the smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth said he knew it. "Are you deaf?" he snarled, nudging her again with the toe of his boot, a casual cruelty in the gesture. "I said move." A low murmur rippled through the onlookers, a wave of hushed whispers and stolen glances. Everyone knew what they'd just witnessed was wrong. Grotesquely, undeniably wrong. But the room remained still, paralyzed by cowardice. Even the judge, perched high on his bench like a distant monarch, offered no reaction. His thin fingers adjusted the wire-rimmed glasses perched on his nose, his gaze dropping back to the stack of papers before him as if the brutality unfolding in his courtroom was beneath his notice, just another mundane ripple in the tide of the day. The woman on the floor clenched her jaw, dragging herself upright with agonizing slowness. Each movement sent a fresh stab of pain through her side, but she forced her trembling hands to smooth the creases of her navy blazer, her fingers lingering on the fabric as she steadied herself. Her chest burned with a fury she could barely swallow, a molten rage that clawed at her throat, begging to be unleashed. She lifted her eyes to meet his, locking onto the arrogance that radiated from him, the way he stood, shoulders squared, chin tilted, utterly convinced that he was untouchable. The whispers grew louder around her, a chaotic hum of confusion and disbelief. "Did she do something?" one voice muttered. "Why isn't anyone stopping this?" another hissed. "She should just leave," a third suggested, timid and resigned. But then, cutting through the noise like a gunshot, came a single voice, sharp, commanding, and unafraid. "You really have no idea who she is, do you?" The words sliced through the tension, hanging in the air with a weight that made the cop falter. For the first time, something flickered across his face. Confusion, a flicker of hesitation, a crack in his armor of certainty. He scoffed, shaking his head dismissively. "And why the hell would I care?" he shot back, his tone brash but brittle, betraying the unease creeping into his gut. The room fell silent again, every eye now fixed on the woman who still hadn't spoken. She rose to her full height, her movements deliberate despite the pain, her presence suddenly commanding in a way that made the air feel heavier. She exhaled slowly, the weight of the moment pressing against her chest like a storm about to break. She took a single step forward, her gaze never leaving his, and in that instant the entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. What came next? One sentence, one devastating revelation, would unravel everything this man thought he knew about power, about privilege, about the invincibility he wore like a second skin. Because he hadn't just kicked any woman. He had kicked Monique Thompson, the governor of the state, a black woman who had risen from the ashes of a system designed to crush her. A woman whose quiet strength and unyielding resolve had rewritten the rules of justice in a world that thrived on its absence. The morning had begun under a sky choked with heavy, slate-gray clouds, the sun barely daring to peek through as it cast long, mournful shadows over Atlanta's towering stone courthouse. The building stood like a sentinel, its weathered facade a testament to centuries of trials, some noble, most marred by the stains of inequity. Monique Thompson had walked through its grand entrance that day with a measured grace, her low heels clicking sharply against the marble floors, each step echoing with purpose. No one turned to stare, no one whispered her name in recognition. Today, she wasn't the governor whose face graced billboards, or whose policies had reshaped the state, earning her both fierce allies and bitter enemies. Today, she was simply another black woman stepping into a space that had never been built to welcome her, a system that thrived on order and control, not justice. The air inside carried the familiar weight of courthouses, the musty scent of old paper, the polished gleam of wood worn smooth by time, and the ever-present tension that simmered beneath the surface. She knew this atmosphere well. As a young attorney fresh from law school, she'd entered rooms like this brimming with hope, only to learn through bruising experience that justice wasn't a gift handed down. It was a battle waged, a prize clawed from the grip of those who hoarded power. Even then, victory often tasted hollow, overshadowed by the compromises and silences that came with it. Today's visit was meant to be routine, a quiet observation of a case that had seized national attention. A young black man, unarmed, gunned down in his own driveway by police who claimed confusion, fear, a tragic mistake. The defense leaned on excuses. The prosecution pointed to bias, to a system that saw blackness as a threat worthy of death. Monique had come to watch, to bear witness from the shadows, dressed in a simple navy blazer and slacks, her usual heels swapped for flats, her security detail dismissed, her power veiled. But the energy in the courthouse that morning was different, electric, volatile, like the air before a storm. She'd slipped into the reserved seat unnoticed, her intent to blend in, to listen as the wheels of justice creaked under the scrutiny of a watching nation. She'd done this before, moved through spaces where her presence went unrecognized, a habit born from her roots, a reminder of the people she'd sworn to fight for. Yet, as she sat there, the cop's boot had found her, his brutality exposing more than just his prejudice. It laid bare the fragility of a system that bent to the whims of unchecked power. Across the room, a clerk named Evelyn froze, her pen hovering over a ledger. She'd seen countless trials, logged endless hours in this courthouse, but the sight of that kick, of a woman crumpled on the floor, made her stomach twist. She wanted to shout, to demand action, but her voice caught in her throat, stifled by years of watching power play out in ways she couldn't challenge. Beside her, a young attorney named Marcus clenched his fists, his knuckles whitening. He'd taken this case pro bono, driven by a fire to right wrongs, but now he sat powerless, his ideals crashing against the reality of a courtroom that turned a blind eye. Even the bailiff, a grizzled man named Tom who'd spent decades enforcing order, shifted uneasily, his hand twitching toward his belt before falling still. He knew the cop, had shared beers with him after shifts, and the loyalty stung as much as the shame. When Monique spoke at last, her voice was steady, low, and devastating. A single sentence that shattered the cop's smirk and sent a ripple of awe and dread through the room. "I am Governor Monique Thompson," she said, each word a hammer striking stone. The cop's face drained of color, his bravado collapsing into a stunned, gaping silence. The judge's head snapped up, glasses slipping down his nose. Evelyn's pen clattered to the desk. Marcus's eyes widened, a spark of hope igniting in his chest. Tom swore under his breath, turning away as if he could unsee the moment. The spectators erupted into a frenzy of gasps and murmurs, the truth sinking in. This wasn't just an assault, it was a reckoning. What followed left the courtroom speechless, a cascade of consequences that no one, not the cop, not the judge, not the onlookers, could have foreseen. The cop's badge, once a symbol of authority, became a noose tightening around his neck as his career crumbled. Monique stood taller, her pain transmuted into a quiet, unyielding power that demanded accountability. The lesson was searing and clear. Justice, when ignored, has a way of rising from the ashes, and the abuse of power carries a cost that echoes far beyond the moment of its wielding. In that frigid, sterile room, beneath the weight of history and the eyes of a fractured system, one woman's resilience turned the tide, proving that even the mightiest can fall when they mistake privilege for invincibility. The air in the courtroom thrummed with a restless electric tension, the kind that festers in spaces where power twists and warps into something ugly. It clung to the people inside like a second skin. Lawyers shuffled through their notes with hurried, nervous fingers, their brows creased with the weight of unspoken stakes. Officers stood stiffly, hands fidgeting at their belts, adjusting holsters as if the mere act could steady their nerves. Clerks darted their eyes around the room, feigning ignorance to the invisible lines that carved the space into territories of privilege and exclusion. Some wore their unease openly, etched into the tight lines of their faces, while others carried it in the rigid set of their shoulders. Judges perched like hawks, scanning the room with sharp, unreadable gazes, their backs ramrod straight as if defying the chaos beneath them. Amid this simmering unease stood Officer Travis Holt, a towering figure near the courtroom's front. His arms were folded tightly across his broad chest, the creases of his pristine uniform sharp enough to cut glass. The holstered gun at his hip gleamed faintly under the fluorescent lights, a silent testament to the authority he wielded. 15 years on the force had hardened him, taught him the unspoken rules of survival in a world where lines were drawn but rarely enforced. He knew the system's limits, or rather, its lack of them. Rules existed, sure, but they were flimsy things, easily bent or ignored when no one cared enough to hold them up. Complaints had shadowed him over the years: excessive force, misconduct, a temper that flared too hot and too fast. But they were toothless, dissolving into nothing without the weight of real consequences. And consequences? They'd never come close to grazing him. That impunity had forged a confidence in him, a swagger that radiated from his every move, a certainty that he was untouchable, shielded by a system that always seemed to tilt in his favor. His eyes roamed the room lazily, then snagged on a woman who'd just settled into a seat reserved for high-profile guests. She didn't belong, not in the clumsy, awkward way strangers sometimes did, but in a way that gnawed at him, stirring a restless irritation deep in his gut. It was her quiet dignity that did it, the way she sat with her chin lifted, her posture steady and unapologetic. When her gaze met his, unflinching and bold, it sparked something primal in him, a flicker of resentment. Women like her, with their pride and their refusal to shrink, had always rubbed him raw, too proud, too defiant, too unwilling to bow to the order he'd spent years enforcing. Without a second thought, he strode toward her, his boots thudding against the polished floor. The courtroom buzzed with people, but that had never stopped him before. He'd learned long ago that power was best asserted in the open, where everyone could see and no one could forget. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low and edged with a sharpness meant to cut, "I don't know what you think you're doing, but that seat isn't for you." He loomed over her, expecting her to falter, to scramble out of his way like so many had before. But she didn't. She turned her head slowly, her expression a mask of calm he couldn't read. She didn't flinch, didn't shift, just held his stare with a steadiness that made his pulse kick up a notch. "Excuse me?" she said, her voice even, almost soft but carrying a weight that unsettled him. "You're excused," he snapped, his lips twisting into a smirk that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Now get up. That section's for important guests." The way he spat the word important left no room for debate. It was a line in the sand, a challenge. The room hushed, the air growing thick as eyes flicked between them. Some spectators averted their gazes, pretending to busy themselves with papers or whispered side conversations, while others leaned in, their faces alight with the morbid curiosity of watching a train wreck unfold in slow motion. She didn't budge. "Do you even know who—" someone in the row behind her began, their voice trembling with a mix of fear and indignation, but Holt silenced them with a sharp shake of his head. "I don't care who she is," he barked, his tone slicing through the murmur like a blade. "She needs to move, now." His patience, thin to begin with, snapped. Before anyone could react, before the room could catch its breath, his boot lashed out, striking her side with a force that echoed through the silence. The sound was sickening, a dull, wet thud followed by a sharp gasp that rippled outward. Papers fluttered to the floor as hands flew to mouths. "Oh my God," someone whispered, the words hanging heavy in the stunned air. She hit the ground hard, the impact jarring through her ribs like a lightning bolt. Pain seared through her, hot and blinding. But it wasn't the physical ache that stole her breath. It was the sheer gall of it, the brazen, unhesitating violence of a man who didn't just think he could get away with it, but knew he would. Men like Travis Holt didn't pause, didn't doubt because they'd never had to. For a heartbeat, the world blurred, sounds muffled as if she were underwater, drowning in the weight of what had just happened. But as she braced her hands against the cold floor and pushed herself up, something shifted inside her. The faces around her, horror, unease, a quiet complicity that stung worse than the blow, crystallized into a single searing truth. This wasn't just an attack on her. It was a mirror held up to every moment like this one, every time power had been twisted into a weapon and swung without fear of reprisal. Travis smirked down at her, rolling his shoulders as if shaking off a minor annoyance. "You're going to learn to listen," he muttered, his voice dripping with smug satisfaction. He turned slightly, ready to swagger back to his post, basking in the dominance he thought he'd cemented. But before he could take another step, a voice sliced through the room, cold, precise, and unshakable. "You have no idea what you just did." The smirk faltered. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. The room tilted, the energy shifting like a tide pulling back before a wave. The people watching him now weren't the same. Gone was the passive acceptance, the resigned shrugs he'd grown so used to. In their place was something new, a ripple of awareness, a dawning recognition that the ground beneath him wasn't as solid as he'd believed. Something was wrong. Terribly wrong, and he felt it in the prickling at the back of his neck. She rose to her feet, slow and deliberate, adjusting her jacket with a grace that belied the ache pulsing through her side. Her eyes locked onto his, and in that moment, the truth crashed over him like a slow, suffocating tide. He hadn't just struck some nameless woman. He'd struck Governor Monique Thompson, the most powerful figure in the state, and the realization carved itself into his widening eyes. He'd misjudged everything, and the mistake wasn't just big, it was catastrophic. The courtroom's atmosphere thickened, the silence so dense it seemed to press against the walls. A moment ago, Travis had stood there, chest puffed out, radiating the kind of arrogance that only comes from years of unchecked power. Now that confidence unraveled, thread by thread, as the shadow of his actions loomed larger. Governor Thompson straightened fully, her presence filling the space despite the pain still radiating through her. There was no outburst, no flash of fury in her gaze, just a quiet, commanding stillness that spoke louder than any scream. She smoothed her blazer's lapels, exhaling a slow, measured breath as if grounding herself, as if the chaos of the moment belonged not to her, but to the fractured system she'd spent her life battling. Beneath that composure, though, her shoulders carried a tension that whispered of deeper wounds. This wasn't just about her bruised ribs or her wounded pride. It was about every time a man like Holt had lashed out and walked away unscathed, every time justice had bent under the weight of power abused. The room stirred. A low murmur at first, then a swelling wave of sound. People shifted uncomfortably in their seats, exchanging glances that ranged from shock to dread. A clerk near the front fumbled a stack of papers, her hands trembling as they scattered across the desk. A judge slammed his gavel down, the sharp crack swallowed by the rising tide of chaos, but it was futile. The balance had shifted, irreversibly. Near the back, a woman with tired eyes and a faded scarf clutched the armrest of her chair, her knuckles whitening. She'd seen scenes like this before. Smaller, quieter, but no less brutal, and the familiarity burned in her chest. Beside her, a young man in a cheap suit whispered to his neighbor, his voice tight with disbelief. "That's the governor," he said, the words barely audible but heavy with meaning. The ripple spread, realization dawning in fragments across the room. Someone gasped near the front, a sharp intake of breath that punctured the suffocating quiet. Travis stood frozen, his smirk gone, replaced by a creeping dread that hollowed out his bravado. He'd always thrived in the gray spaces, where rules were suggestions and power was his to wield. But this was no gray space. This was a reckoning, and as Governor Thompson met his gaze one last time, her silence spoke of a justice he'd never outrun. The lesson was clear, etched into the air between them. Power, when abused, plants the seeds of its own downfall, and for Travis Holt, those seeds had just begun to sprout. Travis Holt's jaw locked tight, the muscles twitching under his skin as his hands balled into fists at his sides, an instinctive reaction he barely registered. The smug smirk that had once curved his lips was long gone, wiped away like dust in a storm, replaced by a flicker of something new. Not fear, not quite yet, but the uneasy ripple of doubt creeping into his mind. He stood there, chest heaving slightly, still grappling with the reality unfolding before him, desperately clinging to the belief that he could smooth-talk his way out of this mess, that the consequences looming on the horizon weren't real, couldn't be real. His eyes darted around the room, scanning the stern face of the judge perched behind the bench, then flitting to the other officers stationed like statues along the walls. He waited, prayed, for one of them to step forward, to take charge, to pull him back from the edge as they always had before. But the room remained still, suffocatingly silent, and the familiar safety net he'd relied on for years began to fray, thread by thread, right before his disbelieving eyes. Monique's voice sliced through the tension like a blade, sharp and unwavering. "Do you even realize what you've done?" Her words were deliberate, each syllable landing with precision, but beneath the calm surface simmered an undercurrent of something dangerous, a warning wrapped in a promise. Holt's gaze snapped to her, then back to the judge, then to the officers again, his mind racing for an ally, a lifeline. He straightened his spine, forcing a scoff from his throat, trying to summon the confidence that had always been his shield. But it slipped through his fingers like sand, leaving his voice thin and brittle as he spoke. "This is a misunderstanding," he insisted, the words sounding hollow even to his own ears, weightless as they drifted into the charged air. "She was in the wrong section. I was just doing my job." Monique tilted her head slightly, her dark eyes locked on him, unblinking, piercing through his flimsy excuse. "Your job?" she echoed, her tone laced with a quiet incredulity that stung more than any shout could have. A sharp exhale escaped her lips, and for a heartbeat, the room seemed to hold its breath with her. Holt pressed on, though his voice had lost its edge, dulled by the growing weight of the moment. "My job is to maintain order," he said, his words faltering as he tried to shore up his crumbling defense. "To ensure security. I didn't know who she was." The courtroom shifted subtly, a ripple of awareness passing through the onlookers, an almost imperceptible change, but one that carried the weight of truth. His excuse was unraveling, threadbare and useless, because that was the core of it, wasn't it? He hadn't known who she was. He hadn't cared to know. He'd seen a figure in the wrong place, made his assumptions, and acted without a second thought, without a shred of hesitation. It was what men like him had done for years, decades, centuries even, wielding power like a blunt instrument, believing it flowed only in one direction, from their hands to the world beneath them. But now the tide was turning, the current shifting beneath his feet, and for the first time Travis Holt felt the ground tremble. The judge's gavel crashed down, a harsh wooden thud that echoed through the chamber, but it did little to tame the rising storm. "I need order in this courtroom," the judge barked, his voice straining for authority. But it rang hollow, a frail echo of command. He wasn't in control anymore. No one was. The reins had slipped, and the chaos was palpable. Monique took a slow, deliberate step forward, and the room seemed to contract around her, every eye riveted, every breath held. "So," she said, her voice low and measured, each word a stone dropped into still water, "you didn't know who I was. That's your excuse?" Holt squared his jaw, defiance flickering in his eyes as he prepared to respond, but she cut him off before he could muster another weak justification. "Tell me, Officer Holt," she pressed, her tone unrelenting. "Would it have made a difference if you had known?" The question hung there, heavy as iron, unyielding as the truth it carried. His lips parted, a protest forming, but no sound came. The answer was glaringly obvious, a spotlight on his failure, and in that moment, the full weight of his actions crashed down on him. For the first time, he understood, really understood, the depth of his mistake, and it chilled him to the bone. Monique drew a sharp breath, her ribs throbbing from the brutal force of his earlier kick, a dull ache pulsing beneath her skin. But she refused to let it show, her face a mask of iron resolve as she turned slightly, addressing not just Holt but the entire room. "This is what happens when power is abused," she declared, her voice steady and resonant, filling the space like a rising tide. "When authority becomes a weapon instead of a duty." Her words carried a quiet fury, a clarity that reverberated through the courtroom, touching every corner, every heart. "This isn't just about me. It's about every single person who's ever stood on the other side of this kind of violence, unseen, unheard, with no cameras, no witnesses, no justice." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, soft but undeniable, a chorus of voices waking to the truth. Holt's breath came faster now, shallow and ragged, his control slipping away like water through clenched fists. This was spiraling beyond him, faster than he could grasp, and the realization gnawed at his gut. Monique turned back to him, her expression unreadable, a calm storm in human form. "So tell me, Officer Holt," she said, her voice cutting through the haze of his panic, "what do you think happens next?" His pulse thundered in his ears, a relentless drumbeat drowning out the world. For the first time in his life, he wasn't sure. Not sure of his next move, not sure if he'd walk away from this unscathed. The certainty that had defined him, the unshakable belief in his own invincibility, was crumbling. Somewhere in the back of the room, the heavy doors swung open with a groan, and a new wave of officers stepped inside. These weren't just any officers. These were the high-ups, internal affairs, men and women in crisp suits and stern expressions, people who'd once been his shield. But now, their faces offered no comfort, no reassurance. They weren't here to save him. Monique took another step closer, deliberate and slow, her presence towering despite her slight frame. "I hope you enjoyed the power while you had it," she murmured, her voice soft but piercing, meant for his ears alone. And in that instant, Travis Holt felt the walls close in, the air grow thick and unbreathable. For the first time in his life, he was powerless, stripped bare, exposed and vulnerable. The worst part? This was only the beginning. The courthouse conference room door shut with a heavy, final click, sealing them inside a space thick with tension and unspoken words. The air felt oppressive, saturated with the weight of what had just unfolded. Travis Holt sat at the long, polished wooden table, his jaw clenched so tightly it ached, the pain radiating up into his temples. His uniform, once a symbol of pride and authority, now clung to him like a straitjacket, the fabric stifling against his sweat-dampened skin. Across from him sat Monique Thompson, composed and unyielding, her posture straight, her gaze impenetrable. The room held only a handful of others, legal advisors with furrowed brows, department heads shifting uncomfortably in their seats, and representatives from the governor's office, their eyes sharp and calculating. All of them watched, waited, the silence stretching taut as a wire. Holt's fingers curled into fists beneath the table, nails digging into his palms as he fought to steady himself. Sweat beaded on the back of his neck, his heart beat a wild, erratic rhythm he couldn't slow. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. Not for him. 15 years on the force. 15 years of the system bending to protect him, to uphold him, to keep men like him untouchable. And now it was turning on him, a beast baring its teeth. Monique leaned forward, elbows resting lightly on the table, her movements precise, deliberate. "You understand the position you're in, don't you?" she asked, her voice calm but laced with an icy edge, a finality that made his stomach twist. He scoffed, the sound weak and unconvincing even to himself. "This is a damn witch hunt," he muttered, shaking his head as if he could dismiss the reality bearing down on him. "I was doing my job. She was in the wrong place. Monique raised a hand, a simple gesture that stopped him cold, her authority cutting through his bluster with terrifying ease. "Stop," she said, the word a quiet command, heavy with the weight of every time a man like him had talked over a woman like her, every time excuses had been flung like lifelines to save drowning egos. His mouth snapped shut, the protest dying in his throat. She exhaled slowly, her eyes never wavering from his, pinning him in place. "You assaulted the governor of this state," she said, her voice flat, stripped of emotion, letting the facts speak their own brutal truth. "In front of witnesses, in a courtroom. And now you want to talk about doing your job?" Holt shifted in his seat, the pressure in his chest tightening like a vice. "I didn't know," he started, but she cut him off again, her interruption swift and merciless. "And that's the problem, isn't it?" she said, her words a scalpel slicing through his defenses. "You didn't know, but you assumed, and because you assumed, you felt entitled to violence." His fists clenched tighter, knuckles whitening as the truth settled over him like a shroud. The lesson here wasn't just about him or Monique. It was about justice, about the inevitable consequences of wielding power without accountability. For too long, he'd believed himself above reproach, a cog in a machine designed to protect its own. But now that machine was grinding to a halt and he was caught in its gears, exposed and alone. The room watched in silence, the weight of their gazes a judgment in itself, and Holt realized with a sinking dread that this wasn't just a reckoning. It was a warning to anyone who dared to forget that power, unchecked, always comes with a price. Travis Holt's fingers curled tightly into his fists, his nails biting deep into the tender flesh of his palms until he could feel the sting of broken skin. "This is it," he whispered to himself, the words slipping out in a shaky, barely audible mutter, as if saying them aloud might somehow anchor him to a reality that was slipping away. His heart thudded violently in his chest, a relentless drumbeat that drowned out the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. The room around him buzzed with tension, the air heavy with the unspoken judgment of the others present, colleagues, witnesses, strangers, all watching him unravel. Across the table, Monique Thompson's face hardened, her once calm demeanor cracking under the weight of exasperation. Her dark eyes narrowed, glinting with a fire that seemed to burn hotter with every passing second. She leaned forward ever so slightly, her head tilting as if she were studying him, dissecting him. "I've seen people resist," she said, her voice low but laced with an edge sharp enough to cut through steel. "I've seen them lie, squirm, and lash out when cornered. Tell me, Officer Holt, did I resist you? Did I threaten you?" Did I do anything at all except sit there in that chair, minding my own business? Her words hung in the air, heavy and deliberate, daring him to answer. The silence that followed was suffocating. It stretched on, an endless void that swallowed every sound except the ragged rhythm of Holt's own breathing. He could feel the eyes of everyone in the room boring into him, some curious, some accusing, all relentless. The walls of his carefully constructed world were crumbling, brick by brick, and he was powerless to stop it. Every ounce of authority he'd spent years building, every shred of confidence he'd worn like armor, was peeling away, leaving him exposed and raw. Monique sighed, a sound so weary it seemed to carry the weight of a lifetime. She leaned back in her chair, her posture relaxed yet commanding, as if this confrontation were merely another chapter in a story she'd lived through too many times. "I've spent my entire life fighting against men like you," she said, her voice softening but losing none of its bite. "Men who clutch power like it's a toy they can swing around without ever facing the mess they leave behind. And for too long, you've been right. You've gotten away with it. No consequences, no reckoning. Just you, strutting through life, untouchable." Her gaze locked onto his, unyielding, and Holt felt a shiver crawl up his spine. His pulse pounded against his temples, a throbbing ache that matched the growing panic clawing at his chest. "You're going to ruin my life over one mistake," he snapped, his voice trembling with a mix of desperation and defiance. "One damn mistake?" The words spilled out before he could stop them, raw and jagged, revealing more of his fear than he'd intended. Monique's lips twisted into a humorless laugh, a sound that echoed with bitter disbelief. She shook her head slowly, her expression a blend of pity and scorn. "One mistake?" she repeated, her tone mocking as she let the phrase linger in the air. "Is that what you think this is, Holt?" She leaned in closer now, just enough that he could feel the weight of her presence pressing against him. Her voice dropped to a near whisper, each word striking like a hammer against stone. "You're not sitting here because of one slip-up, Officer Holt. You're here because this time, this one, single time, you finally crossed the wrong person." The truth in her words hit him like a punch to the gut, twisting his stomach into knots. He swallowed hard, his throat so dry it felt like sandpaper. Monique eased back into her chair, folding her hands neatly in front of her, with a calmness that only deepened his unease. "Do you know how many complaints have been filed against you?" she asked, her tone casual, almost conversational. Holt didn't respond. He couldn't. He didn't need to. Her eyes never wavered, pinning him in place. 11, she said, letting the number drop like a stone into still water. 11 excessive force complaints, 7 of them from black citizens, 5 of those from black women. She paused, letting the statistics sink in, each one a nail in the coffin of his career. Holt's jaw tightened, his teeth grinding together as he fought to keep his composure. But Monique wasn't done. "What happened today wasn't some fluke," she continued, her voice steady and unrelenting. "It wasn't a misunderstanding or a bad day. It was a pattern, a ugly, festering pattern that's finally caught up with you." The weight of her accusations settled over the room like a storm cloud, dark and oppressive. Holt could feel it pressing down on him, crushing the air from his lungs, suffocating him in a way he'd never experienced before. For the first time, he understood what it was to be powerless. Monique exhaled sharply, pushing herself back from the table with a slow, deliberate motion. The room seemed to freeze, every eye trained on her as she spoke. "Here's what's going to happen," she said, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "As of this moment, you're on immediate suspension without pay. A full internal investigation is already underway. And when the findings come back, and we both know how that's going to turn out, your badge will be gone, stripped away. And then, Officer Holt, you'll face criminal charges for assault." Holt's stomach lurched, a wave of nausea crashing over him. Panic clawed at his chest, wild and unrelenting. "No," he stammered, shaking his head as if he could will her words away. "You can't do this." "Oh, I can," Monique interrupted smoothly, her tone as cool and unyielding as steel. "And I will." He shot to his feet, the chair scraping harshly against the tiled floor, the sound grating in the tense stillness. "This is political," he hissed, his voice rising with a frantic edge. "This is personal." Monique's expression hardened, her eyes flashing with a fury that made him flinch. "You're damn right it's personal," she said, her voice sharp enough to slice through his bravado. "It's personal for every black man and woman who's ever been brutalized by someone like you. It's personal for every family who's had to bury someone they loved because a cop decided their life didn't matter." She took a step closer, her presence towering despite her smaller frame. "You don't get it, do you? This isn't how it works for people like me? That's what you were going to say, wasn't it? People like you don't lose. People like you don't face consequences. People like you don't fall." But he was falling, plummeting into an abyss he'd never imagined. His breath came in uneven gasps, his chest heaving as the weight of his own words turned against him. Monique watched him for a long, agonizing moment, her gaze piercing through every layer of his crumbling facade. Then, with a grace that belied the storm raging between them, she rose from her seat and smoothed the front of her blazer. "You've had 15 years of power, Officer Holt," she said, her voice steady and final. "I hope you savored every second of it because it's over now." Holt's vision blurred, his pulse roaring in his ears like a freight train. Monique stepped toward the door, her heels clicking softly against the floor, a sound that echoed with finality. She paused just before leaving, turning slightly to glance back at him. "Oh, and one more thing," she added, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of her lips. "You might want to check the news. Your story's already out there." And with that, she was gone, slipping through the door like a shadow, leaving him alone with the wreckage of his life. His hands trembled violently as he fumbled for his phone, nearly dropping it in his haste. His fingers stumbled over the screen, clumsy and uncoordinated, as his pulse thundered so loudly it drowned out the hushed murmurs of the others in the room. The conference room felt claustrophobic now, the walls closing in, the air thick with the stench of his own fear. He didn't need to look to know what awaited him, but some desperate, foolish part of him clung to the hope that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't real. That maybe he could still claw his way out of this nightmare. But then he saw it. His face stared back at him from every corner of the internet, plastered across news sites and social media feeds. The headlines screamed in bold, unforgiving letters, "Georgia Governor Assaulted by White Officer in Courtroom Incident." "Racist Attack Sparks National Outrage." "Calls for immediate termination and arrest of Officer Travis Holt grow louder."
Gatanta.
His stomach twisted into a tight, painful knot, his breath hitching in sharp, ragged bursts as he scrolled through the articles. There was video evidence, grainy, damning footage spreading like wildfire across every platform imaginable. He clicked on one clip, his hands shaking so badly he nearly dropped the phone again. There he was, captured in vivid detail. The arrogance in his squared shoulders, the sneer curling his lips, the brutal kick he'd delivered to Monique Thompson, the governor of Georgia, like she was nothing more than trash to be swept aside. His own voice echoed back at him, dripping with venom and entitlement. "Get the hell out of that seat, lady. This ain't for your kind." The words felt alien now, as if they'd been spoken by a stranger, but they weren't. They were his, and they were the noose tightening around his neck. A sharp knock at the door jolted him from his spiraling thoughts. He flinched, his head snapping up as two men in crisp, dark suits stepped into the room. Their faces were stone-cold, unreadable masks, but their eyes betrayed them, cold, clinical, and utterly devoid of sympathy. He knew who they were before they even spoke. Internal Affairs. "Officer Holt," one of them said, his voice flat and controlled, a stark contrast to the chaos raging inside Travis. "We need to speak with you." Travis swallowed hard, his throat so dry it burned. The phone slipped from his grasp, clattering onto the table as the reality of his fall crashed down around him. Just as he realized too late, wasn't just a word. It was a force, relentless and unforgiving, and it had finally come for him. The lesson was clear. Power, when abused, didn't shield you from consequences. It only delayed them, making the reckoning that much harder when it arrived. Travis Holt's mind raced. a frantic whirlwind of desperation clawing at the edges of his thoughts as he groped for something, anything, that might unravel the catastrophe swallowing him whole. His brain churned, searching for an excuse, a justification, a single thread of logic to stitch together a defense. But it was like grasping at smoke. Nothing came. His tongue felt heavy, useless, cemented to the roof of his mouth. There were no words to shield him, no barricade of explanations to hide behind, because the truth loomed too large to deny. He had no defense. With a groan that echoed in his bones, he forced himself upright, his legs trembling beneath him as though they might buckle under the weight of his own shame. The room spun slightly, a nauseating tilt that matched the chaos in his chest. This is spiraling out of control, he rasped, his voice rough and cracked, scraping against the air like sandpaper. I didn't know. But before he could finish, the first agent silenced him with a sharp, authoritative lift of his hand, the gesture slicing through Travis's plea like a guillotine. We're not here to negotiate or debate, the agent said, his tone flat, unyielding, a wall of stone. We're here to deliver the facts. As of this very moment, you're on unpaid leave, effective immediately, pending a full investigation. The words landed like a punch to Travis's gut, knocking the breath from him. Unpaid. His voice faltered, barely a whisper as it stumbled out. I've got a family. The second agent cut in, his voice colder still, a frigid wind that chilled Travis to his core. We strongly recommend you find yourself a lawyer and fast, he said, his eyes narrowing slightly, glinting with a quiet menace. Because this isn't just an internal matter anymore. The governor's office has stepped in. They've formally requested a criminal investigation. The DA's office is already digging through potential charges. Travis's world lurched violently, the floor beneath him seeming to dissolve as the words sank in. Criminal charges? His head shook in disbelief, a reflexive denial of the nightmare unfolding before him. This is insane, he muttered, his voice a fragile thread threatening to snap. You're acting like I'm some kind of monster, like I broke the law. I was just doing my job. The first agent's face hardened, his jaw tightening as his gaze bore into Travis with unrelenting intensity. Your job, he said, each word deliberate and cutting, does not include laying hands on a sitting governor in front of a crowd of witnesses. Travis let out a laugh then, a jagged, bitter sound that clawed its way up from his chest. It wasn't amusement. It was desperation, raw and unfiltered, spilling out of him like blood from a wound. She's turning me into a scapegoat, he snapped, his voice rising with a mix of fury and fear. This isn't justice. She's out for revenge. The second agent didn't flinch, didn't even blink. No, he corrected, his tone as steady as a judge's gavel. She wants justice. Travis opened his mouth to fire back, to hurl something defiant into the void, but the words caught in his throat, lodged there like shards of glass. His entire body felt ablaze, a searing heat radiating from within as panic and rage battled for dominance. The door swung open again, creaking on its hinges, and this time it wasn't the agents returning with more bad news. It was his captain, a man Travis had known for years, whose weathered face now carried an expression that hit harder than any reprimand. An eerie calm, a quiet resignation that spoke of finality. Halt, the captain said, running a hand over his face as though trying to erase the exhaustion etched into his features. We need to talk. Travis nodded stiffly, his breath shallow and uneven as he followed the older man out into the hallway. The courthouse had transformed into a tempest of chaos. Cameras flashing like lightning, reporters buzzing like a swarm of relentless hornets, security personnel multiplying as if preparing for a siege. He caught glimpses of his colleagues in the distance, their faces a gallery of reactions. Some whispered behind cupped hands, others turned away as if he were contagious, and a few stared at him with looks he'd never seen directed his way before. Disgust, cold and palpable, crawling over his skin like a living thing. The footage had spread like wildfire, his own voice damning him with every replayed syllable, and there was no undoing it. The captain led him into a quieter corridor, a narrow sanctuary away from the storm. The door clicked shut behind them, sealing them in a suffocating silence. "I tried," the captain began, his voice low and heavy, carrying the weight of years spent shielding his men. "I tried to protect you, Holt. I really did. But this? There's no pulling you out of this fire." Travis swallowed hard, his throat dry as sand. "Captain, I don't—" The older man raised a hand, cutting him off mid-sentence. "Don't waste my time with excuses. I let things slide before when I shouldn't have. Covered for you because I believed you were a good cop with a hot head, but this?" He shook his head, disappointment flickering in his tired eyes. "This was your doing, and now you're finished." Something inside Travis fractured, a sharp, splintering crack that reverberated through his chest. "So that's it?" he demanded, his voice trembling with a mix of defiance and dread. "You're just tossing me out like trash?" The captain sighed, a long, weary sound that seemed to drain the air from the room. "You threw yourself away, Travis." His breathing grew shallow, rapid as panic clawed at his lungs. "I can fix this," he insisted, the words tumbling out in a shaky rush. "If I apologize, if I make a public statement—" "You don't get it," the captain interrupted, his voice firm now, unyielding. "There's nothing left to salvage. You assaulted the most powerful black woman in this state, on camera, in a courthouse, with the whole damn country watching." Travis's pulse thundered in his skull, a relentless drumbeat drowning out reason. "So what? I'm just supposed to let them ruin me? My pension? My benefits? My—" The captain's expression didn't soften, his voice flat and final. "You won't have any of that. Your pension's gone, your career's gone, and you better hope they don't lock you up with the same people you put behind bars." The word prison hit Travis like a physical blow, a visceral jolt that sent ice through his veins. His breath caught, sharp and ragged as the reality sank in. Prison? That was a fate for others, men he'd cuffed and dragged away, not him. He'd been the one wielding the keys, not trembling at the thought of the lock turning on him. "No," he whispered, stepping back as if he could physically escape the truth. "This isn't happening." But it was, and the bitterest pill to swallow was that he'd brought it on himself. The captain's phone buzzed, a harsh vibration against the silence. He glanced at the screen, exhaled sharply, and met Travis's eyes with a grim finality. "They're coming for you," he said simply, "and there's nothing I can do." Travis's legs wobbled, his hand shooting out to brace against the wall as his vision blurred, the edges of the world fraying like torn fabric. He'd seen careers crumble before, cops losing their badges, some even facing bars, but never like this, never with the nation's eyes fixed on him, hungry for justice. His voice broke when he finally spoke, a fractured plea. "I can't go to prison." The captain's face remained impassive, a mask of inevitability. "Then you should have thought of that before you kicked the governor of Georgia in a courtroom packed with cameras." A knock rattled the door, sharp and insistent, signaling the end. For the first time in his life, Travis Holt understood powerlessness, not as an abstract concept, but as a crushing, suffocating reality pressing down on him. He found himself in an interrogation room soon after, the dull gray walls closing in like a tomb. The fluorescent light overhead flickered erratically, casting jagged shadows across his face, accentuating the hollows beneath his eyes. His hands, once steady enough to wield authority, now shook uncontrollably against the cold metal table. The air reeked of sweat and stale coffee, a sour tang that clung to his nostrils, but all he could hear was the oppressive silence, a stark contrast to the courthouse's earlier cacophony of gasps, murmurs, and the weight of his own hubris crashing down. The door creaked open with a harsh grating sound, but Travis didn't lift his gaze at first, too lost in the spiraling abyss of his thoughts. Only when the chair scraped against the floor, A slow, deliberate screech did he register the presence across from him. The figure sat with measured calm, exuding an air of quiet control. "Officer Holt," the voice said, steady and unreadable, slicing through the stillness. Travis swallowed hard, his throat tight with dread. He knew that voice. Detective James Porter from Internal Affairs, a man who'd turned a blind eye to Travis's missteps more times than he could count, who'd brushed aside complaints with a shrug. But there was no leniency in his tone now, no flicker of the old camaraderie. The game had changed, and Travis was no longer a player. He was the pawn. The lesson here stretched beyond Travis's personal ruin. It was a glaring testament to justice, a reminder that power, when wielded recklessly, invited consequences as relentless as a tidal wave. The governor, a figure of resilience and authority, hadn't just been a victim. She'd become a symbol, her demand for accountability echoing through the corridors of power and the streets alike. And Travis, once cloaked in the armor of his badge, now stood stripped bare, a cautionary tale of how arrogance could topple even the mightiest. The captain, the agents, even Porter, they weren't just witnesses to his fall, they were threads in a tapestry of reckoning, each bearing their own quiet burdens of guilt, duty, or resolve. In the end, the true depth of the story lay not just in Travis's descent, but in the unyielding truth it revealed. No one, no matter their station, could outrun the scales of justice when they tipped against them. In the suffocating stillness of the interrogation room, Travis Holt sat slumped in a metal chair that creaked under his weight, his broad shoulders hunched as though the world itself pressed down on them. He had once been a towering figure, cloaked in the unspoken loyalty that bound men like him. Cops who lived by a code as old as the badge itself. A shield woven from silence and mutual protection. But now, that shield was gone, stripped away like a tattered flag in a storm. His jaw tightened until the muscles ached, a faint tremor running through him as he muttered under his breath, his voice raw and gravelly, like it had been scraped across a desert floor. "This is a setup," he rasped, the words tasting bitter on his tongue. "This is political." Across the scratched steel table, Porter leaned back in his chair, arms crossed over his chest, his posture relaxed yet unyielding. He'd been Travis's partner once, his brother in arms, the one who'd always had his back when the lines blurred and the rules bent. Now, though, Porter's face was a mask of stone, his dark eyes steady and unreadable. "No, Travis," he said, his voice calm but edged with a weight that sliced through the air. "This is accountability." The word landed like a punch to Travis's gut, sending a cold shiver racing down his spine. He tried to hide it, forcing out a laugh, a hollow, jagged sound that echoed off the bare concrete walls. "Come on, Porter," he sneered, his lips curling into a mockery of a smile. "You and I both know how this game works. We look out for each other. Always have." Porter didn't flinch. His gaze held Travis's, unwavering, a quiet certainty radiating from him that made Travis's stomach twist into knots. There was no trace of the old camaraderie, no flicker of the understanding they'd once shared. Travis searched those eyes desperately, like a drowning man clawing for a lifeline, hoping to find some hint that this was all a nightmare, a cruel joke they'd laugh about later over beers. But there was nothing, just the stark, unfeeling truth staring back at him. The system they'd both served, the one that had cradled them in its shadow and forgiven their sins, had turned its back. For the first time, Travis felt the full, crushing weight of its abandonment. With a slow, deliberate sigh, Porter unfolded a thick manila file and slid it across the table, the sound of paper scraping metal grating against Travis's frayed nerves. "You don't get it, do you, Holt?" Porter said, his tone measured but heavy with implication. "This isn't some petty screw-up we can bury. We're talking felony assault charges here. Serious time." He tapped the file with a finger, the gesture casual yet pointed. "You think this is just gonna vanish? That you'll walk away with a slap on the wrist and a stern warning? The governor might not be the one filing the paperwork, but the DA's got blood in his eyes. He's coming for you." Travis scoffed, shaking his head as if he could dismiss the words with the motion. "This is insane," he snapped, but his voice faltered, the bravado crumbling as the reality clawed at him. "I didn't—" He cut himself off, the denial dying in his throat. He didn't need to finish the sentence. They both knew what he'd done. The grainy security footage had captured every damning second, his boot slamming into the governor's ribs, his own voice snarling threats through gritted teeth. There was no erasing it, no spinning it away. Porter flipped a page in the file, his eyes skimming the text for a brief moment before locking onto Travis again. "You're looking at prison, man," he said flatly. "Even if you take a plea, the badge is gone. Pension? Forget it. The union won't come within a mile of this mess. You've got no one left in your corner." The words tightened around Travis's chest like a vice, squeezing the air from his lungs. His throat burned as he swallowed hard, fighting the panic rising inside him. "That's not true," he croaked, but the lie sounded weak even to his own ears. Porter tilted his head, giving him a look that pierced straight through the bravado, a mix of pity and exasperation that made Travis want to crawl out of his skin. "You haven't checked your phone, have you?" Porter asked, his voice low, almost gentle. Travis's hands twitched on the table, his fingers itching to reach for the device in his pocket, but he didn't move. He didn't need to. Deep down, he already knew what he'd find. The silence from his so-called brothers in blue, the ones he'd bled beside, laughed with, covered for. They'd gone quiet as ghosts. His friends, his allies, the whole damn network he'd built over 15 years of service. They'd cut him loose without a second thought, scattering like rats from a sinking ship. Porter's voice broke through the haze again, steady and unrelenting. "They're throwing you to the wolves, Travis. The department's already issued a statement, condemned you outright. Your captain's dodging your calls. Hell, the mayor went on national TV this morning calling for your head on a platter." He paused, leaning forward slightly, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "They're gonna make an example out of you. Because for once, the system isn't bending over backwards to protect you." A deep, gnawing sickness bloomed in Travis's gut, spreading like ice through his veins. He clenched his teeth, trying to summon the fire that had always burned inside him, the righteous fury that had carried him through every close call, every questionable choice. But it wouldn't come. All he felt was a hollow, creeping fear, cold and unfamiliar, gnawing at the edges of his mind. "They can't lock me up," he said, quieter now, his voice trembling as if he were trying to convince himself more than Porter. "They won't." Porter watched him for a long moment, his expression softening just enough to hint at the man who'd once called Travis a friend. "You still think you're untouchable, don't you?" he said, almost sadly. When Travis didn't answer, Porter sighed again and closed the file with a soft thud. "You've got two paths here. Fight it. Take your chances in court with every camera in the country trained on you, or—" He hesitated, letting the word hang in the air before continuing. "Or you take the deal, resign, cooperate with the investigation, and maybe, just maybe, you avoid a cell. They'll still tear your life apart, but you'll keep your freedom. Start over somewhere new. Start over." The phrase felt alien, absurd, like a language Travis had never learned. For 15 years, he'd been the one with the power, the control, the gleaming badge that made him a god among men. He'd built his entire existence around it, every swaggering step, every barked order, every backroom favor. And now they wanted him to walk away, to shed it all like a snake sloughing off its skin? His mouth went dry, his tongue heavy as he forced out a response. "And if I don't?" Porter's face hardened, the faint flicker of sympathy vanishing. "Then you roll the dice," he said, his tone clipped. "But I'll tell you this, Travis, if this goes to trial, you're done. You'll lose, and when you fall, it'll be hard. No coming back from it." The words hit like a sledgehammer, shattering the last fragile threads of Travis's defiance. His chest tightened until he could barely breathe, his mind a chaotic storm of rage and despair. Everything he'd known, everything he'd been, it was slipping through his fingers, crumbling into dust. I need time, he murmured, the plea barely audible. Porter stood, the chair scraping against the floor with a slow, deliberate screech that echoed in the small room. You don't have much of it, he said simply, then turned and walked out, the door clicking shut behind him with a finality that reverberated in Travis's bones. The silence that followed was suffocating, pressing against his ribs until they ached. His hands curled into fists, then fell limp, trembling as he reached for his phone. He didn't want to look, but he couldn't stop himself. The screen lit up with a flood of unread messages, dozens, maybe hundreds, from numbers he knew by heart, friends, family, colleagues. He scrolled through them, each one a dagger to the chest. We can't be seen with you. Don't reach out. You're on your own. And then the one that stopped him cold. Don't call us anymore. From his brother, his own flesh and blood, the one person he'd thought would never turn away. His breath hitched, a sharp, ragged sound, and the phone slipped from his shaking hands, clattering onto the table. He caught his reflection in the one-way mirror across the room. A pale, disheveled shell of a man staring back at him, eyes hollow and lost. That wasn't Travis Holt. Not the Travis Holt who'd walked with a swagger, who'd commanded respect with a glance, who'd believed himself invincible. That man was gone, erased by the weight of his own actions, by a system that had once lifted him up and now cast him down. The headlines, the whispers, the consequences, they weren't fading. They were his new reality, a prison of a different kind, built not of bars but of isolation and shame. For the first time, Travis understood what it meant to be truly alone. Later that night, he sat in the dim glow of his apartment, the flickering light of the television painting the walls in shades of blue and gray. The news anchor's voices droned on, dissecting his downfall with clinical precision, his face plastered across every channel, his name a synonym for disgrace. Travis Holt, the disgraced officer caught on tape assaulting Georgia's governor. The words blended into a dull hum, background noise to the leaden weight pinning him to the couch. He'd seen the footage 100 times by now, replayed endlessly on every screen. His own snarl, his own boot, the governor's crumpled form. The man who'd once wielded power like a weapon was now nothing more than a cautionary tale, a symbol of justice finally catching up to those who'd abused it. And as the glow of the TV flickered against his vacant stare, Travis Holt felt the full, suffocating depth of that lesson settle into his soul. Power, unchecked, had a price, and he was paying it in full. The courtroom footage had spread like wildfire, flickering across screens everywhere, an inescapable specter that clung to the edges of his waking hours and haunted his restless sleep. It wasn't just a fleeting moment of shame, it was a relentless nightmare. A shadow that had fused itself to the fabric of his reality and refused to release its grip. In those first chaotic days, his phone had buzzed incessantly, a maddening chorus of notifications that drowned out his thoughts. Messages flooded in from every corner, reporters hounding him for a quote to splash across their headlines, old buddies who'd once slapped him on the back now scrambling to sever ties before the wreckage of his life could taint theirs. At first, the barrage was overwhelming. A tidal wave of voices demanding answers or hurling accusations. But soon, the deluge slowed to a pitiful drip, just a handful of texts from numbers he knew by heart, though the people behind them felt like strangers now. His family had quietly slipped away, their silence louder than any words they might have spoken. Colleagues he'd once shared coffee with in the precinct break room vanished into thin air, their loyalty evaporating the moment his name became a liability. Even those who might have once stood in his corner, out of stubbornness or pity, had clammed up, unwilling to risk their own reputations for a man who'd become radioactive. The television droned on in the background, a constant hum of noise he couldn't bring himself to face. He didn't need to look. The images were seared into his mind, replaying in an endless loop he couldn't pause or erase. He could still see himself standing there in that courtroom, arms folded tight across his chest, his chin tilted upward in a posture dripping with disdain. The arrogance had radiated off him like heat from asphalt, so blatant it made his stomach twist to recall it now. He'd stared down at her, Monique Thompson, crumpled on the floor where he'd shoved her, his boot connecting with her side as if she were less than human, a nuisance to be swept aside. The words he'd flung at her echoed in his skull, sharp and careless, spilling from his lips without a second's hesitation. "Get the hell out of that seat, lady. This ain't for your kind." He'd said it so effortlessly, the venom rolling off his tongue as if it were nothing, as if she were nothing. Back then, it hadn't even registered as a choice, just another flex of the authority he'd worn like a second skin. But now those words were the only lens the world used to see him. Overnight, he'd gone from a decorated officer, a man who'd once strutted through life believing he was untouchable, to a pariah, a walking disgrace. He wasn't just a villain in their eyes. He'd become a symbol, a lightning rod for every ounce of rage and pain people had been carrying for years. A sudden sharp rap at his door jolted him from his spiraling thoughts. His breath caught in his throat, his heart slamming against his ribs with a force that made his chest ache. His hands tightened into fists, nails digging into his palms as his pulse roared in his ears, loud and unsteady. Days had passed since anyone dared come near his crumbling sanctuary. Not a neighbor, not a delivery guy, not even some smug bastard looking to gloat over his downfall. So who was out there now, hammering on his door with such purpose? He sat there, rigid as stone, willing the sound to vanish, praying whoever it was would lose interest and slink away. But then it came again, louder, more determined, a knock that seemed to vibrate through the walls and settle in his bones. Something primal stirred in his gut, a quiet warning that this wasn't someone he could brush off. Swallowing hard, his mouth dry as a desert wind, he dragged himself to his feet. Every step felt like wading through molasses, his limbs heavy with dread and exhaustion. His hand lingered over the doorknob, trembling faintly before he forced himself to twist it, easing the door open with a slow, reluctant creak. The sight on the other side stole the air from his lungs. Monique Thompson stood there, just beyond the threshold, her silhouette framed by the dim glow of the porch light. She held herself with a quiet composure, her face unreadable yet charged with an intensity that made the air crackle. No entourage trailed her, no swarm of reporters with flashing cameras, no security guards poised to intervene, no lawyers itching to tighten the noose around his neck. She was alone, and that solitude carried a weight more unsettling than any mob he'd braced himself for. He'd imagined her as a distant figure after the trial, untouchable, elevated by her victory, forever beyond his reach. Yet here she was, standing on his doorstep, her eyes locking onto his with a purpose that felt both intimate and foreboding. Up close, without the courtroom's harsh lights or the public's relentless gaze, he could see the toll it had taken on her. Her face bore the faint lines of exhaustion, her shoulders subtly hunched under an invisible burden. This wasn't just about him, he realized with a jolt. This had never been just about him. She carried something bigger, something heavier, and it shadowed her every movement. For a long, suffocating moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched between them, thick and oppressive, pressing against his chest until he could barely breathe. His throat tightened, not with the old familiar burn of anger or the brittle shield of pride, but with something rawer, something he couldn't name. He knew he should say something, demand why she'd come, what she could possibly want from him now that she'd already stripped him bare in front of the world. But the words would not come. Deep down, in a corner of his soul he'd spent years ignoring, he understood that whatever she was about to say mattered more than any defense he could muster. She broke the stillness first, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "I wasn't sure you'd open the door." It was steady, deliberate, but beneath it lingered a note. Not quite anger, not quite pity, but a fragile thread woven between the two. He let out a harsh breath, dragging a hand down his face, his stubble rough against his palm. "Didn't think you'd ever want to see me again," he rasped, his voice sounding foreign to his own ears, worn thin by days of isolation. Monique studied him, her gaze piercing yet measured, before she gave a slight nod. "I don't." The words landed like a punch, sharp and unyielding. But he didn't flinch. He couldn't. She had every right to despise him, every reason to savor the sight of him broken beneath the weight of his own actions. And yet, she was here, which meant there was more to this than vengeance. She took a small step forward, the faint light casting deeper shadows across her face, accentuating the weariness etched into her features. "But I needed to ask you something." Travis let out a hollow, bitter laugh, shaking his head as he dropped his gaze to the scuffed floorboards before dragging it back to her. "You came all this way just to ask me something? Could have had my lawyer deliver the kill shot instead." His tone was edged with sarcasm, a flimsy armor against the vulnerability creeping up his spine. Monique didn't so much as blink, her expression unwavering. "Do you regret it?" The question hit him like a sledgehammer. Simple, yet brutal, reverberating through his chest until he could feel it in his bones. His jaw clenched, his mind racing as he groped for an answer, any answer that might hold up under her scrutiny. Did he regret it? The kick, the venomous words, the casual cruelty he'd wielded like a weapon? Or did he only regret that this time it had cost him everything? His career, his family, his name. He opened his mouth, then shut it again, a sharp exhale escaping him. "I don't know," he muttered, the admission tasting like ash on his tongue. Her eyes narrowed slightly, a flicker of something, disappointment maybe, sharpening her gaze. "That's not good enough." Travis let out a ragged breath, almost a sigh, running a hand through his hair and gripping the back of his neck as if to steady himself. He forced his eyes to meet hers again. "What do you want me to say?" he asked, his voice fraying at the edges. "The truth?" Another bitter chuckle escaped him, his throat tightening painfully. "The truth," he repeated, the words grating like stones grinding together. His hands balled into fists at his sides, knuckles whitening. "The truth is, I didn't think. I didn't stop. I didn't even hesitate. And now," his voice dropped, barely above a whisper, as if he were speaking to the ghost of the man he used to be. "Now I don't even know who I am when I look in the mirror." The confession hung there, raw and jagged, filling the space between them with its weight. Silence settled again, dense and stifling, wrapping around them like a shroud. Monique inhaled slowly, crossing her arms as she regarded him with an intensity that bordered on sorrow. "Do you know how many people have told me they regret what they did after they lost everything?" Her voice was soft, but each syllable carried the force of a judge's gavel. "It's always the same story." Travis's jaw tightened, a muscle ticking beneath the skin. "You think I'm just another one of them?" he shot back, defiance flaring briefly before it flickered out. She tilted her head just enough to catch the light, her expression unreadable yet piercing. "Aren't you?" The question lingered, unanswered, as the weight of justice and the consequences of his abuse of power pressed down on him, undeniable and unrelenting. In that moment, Travis saw the depth of what he'd unleashed, not just on Monique, but on himself, and the bitter lesson that power, unchecked, devoured everything in its path, leaving nothing but ruins behind. Travis Holt stood motionless in the dim, suffocating stillness of his apartment, the echoes of Monique Thompson's footsteps fading into a memory that gnawed at his soul. His chest felt like it had been hollowed out, each breath a shallow, ragged gasp that barely kept him upright. The door hung slightly ajar, a cruel tease of possibility, as if she might spin around at any moment, her silhouette framed by the hallway light, offering him a lifeline, a resolution, anything to break the unbearable tension coiling around his heart. But she didn't. She had walked away, leaving behind a silence so thick it pressed against his skin, and a question that lingered like a shadow he couldn't shake. Was he worth forgiving? He wanted to scream after her, to let the words claw their way out of his throat, words of denial, of desperate justification. He longed to tell her he wasn't the monster the world now saw, that he hadn't meant for the chaos to unfold, that he was different from the others who wore the badge like a crown and wielded power like a blade. But even as the thoughts churned in his mind, they soured before they could form, tasting bitter and false like ash on his tongue. He stayed silent, rooted to the spot, his broad shoulders slumping under the weight of a truth he couldn't outrun. Monique had stood there moments before, her presence filling the room with an intensity that made the air feel electric. Her eyes, sharp and unreadable, had locked onto his, peeling back the layers of his carefully crafted facade. She'd exhaled, a slow, deliberate breath that carried years of disappointment, and her voice, steady yet laced with something raw, had cut through him like a knife. "I wanted to see if you were worth forgiving," she'd said, and the words landed like a punch, tightening his chest until he could barely breathe. His reply had scraped out of him, hoarse and trembling, a plea wrapped in defeat. She'd studied him then, her gaze stretching into an eternity, each second a silent judgment that left him exposed and vulnerable. Finally, she shook her head, a small, decisive movement that shattered something inside him. "I don't know yet," she murmured. And with that, she turned, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor as she vanished into the night, leaving him adrift in the wreckage of his own making. The apartment felt colder now, the shadows stretching longer across the walls, as if the room itself were closing in to swallow him whole. Travis shuffled toward the living room, his legs heavy, like they were dragging through quicksand. The television flickered in the corner, its muted glow casting eerie shapes across the furniture. The same damning headlines scrolled relentlessly across the screen, bold, accusing letters branding him a villain in a story he no longer controlled. He collapsed onto the couch, the cushions sinking beneath him, and pressed his palms against his temples, trying to knead away the exhaustion that seeped into his bones. His once proud frame, broad and commanding, now curled inward, a man diminished by the consequences of his own choices. He'd lost everything. The badge that had defined him, polished and pinned to his chest with pride, was gone, stripped away in a blaze of disgrace. His career, built on years of unwavering certainty, lay in ruins, reduced to a cautionary tale whispered in precinct hallways. His reputation, once a shield, was now a target, smeared across newspapers and television screens, a name synonymous with corruption and betrayal. Even his so-called friends, the ones who'd clapped him on the back and shared late-night drinks, had evaporated, their absence a stinging rebuke. His family, too, had pulled away, their voices hushed with shame when they spoke his name, if they spoke it at all. For the first time in his life, Travis Holt was utterly alone, a man untethered, staring into an abyss of his own creation. The buzz of his phone jolted him from his spiraling thoughts. It vibrated against the coffee table, a sharp, insistent sound that made his stomach lurch. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the device, fingers trembling as if it might burn him. The name flashing on the screen twisted the knot in his gut tighter. Dad. His father, a towering figure of grit and resolve, a retired cop who'd molded Travis in his image, teaching him the unspoken rules of the job, strength above all, never yield, never flinch. The old man had lived by a code, one he'd drilled into Travis from the moment he could hold a toy gun. Power wasn't given, it was seized, and the world bent to those who knew how to wield it. Travis had swallowed those lessons whole, letting them shape him into the man he'd become, unyielding, authoritative, untouchable. Until now, he answered, his voice cracking as it forced its way out. "Dad?" The silence on the other end stretched on, a cold, creeping void that prickled his skin. When his father finally spoke, his tone was low and edged with a sharpness that sliced through the line. "What the hell were you thinking?" Travis's jaw clenched, his grip on the phone tightening until his knuckles whitened. "I wasn't," he admitted, the words barely audible, a confession that hung heavy between them. "You think that's an excuse?" his father shot back, his voice colder than the winter wind rattling the apartment windows. "You think you can just say I wasn't thinking and that wipes it clean? You didn't just lose your job, Travis, you lost your goddamn name." Travis exhaled hard, dragging a hand down his face, the stubble rough against his palm. "I know that," he muttered, but his father wasn't finished. "No, you don't," the old man snapped, his words like a whip. "You don't get it. This isn't some slap on the wrist, some quiet transfer to a backwater precinct. You're done. Finished. Do you have any idea what people are saying about you out there? A bitter laugh escaped Travis's lips, sharp and hollow as he shook his head. Yeah, Dad, I've seen the news. I know exactly what they're saying. Then tell me something, his father pressed, his voice hardening into steel. Do you regret it? The question hit like a sledgehammer, freezing Travis in place. His heart slammed against his ribs, each beat a painful reminder of the life he'd built and destroyed. It was the same question Monique had left him with, the one he'd spent years believing he'd never have to face. He'd lived his life above accountability, shielded by the badge, convinced that power meant never answering to anyone. But now, standing amid the rubble of his choices, that question loomed larger than ever, demanding a truth he wasn't sure he could find. His throat tightened, his voice a strained whisper. I don't know. The silence that followed was suffocating, a thick fog of disappointment rolling through the line. His father let out a slow, deliberate breath, and when he spoke again, his tone was quieter but no less cutting. Then you're already worse off than I thought. Travis squeezed his eyes shut, a tremor running through him as something deep inside threatened to break. Dad, don't, he started, but his father cut him off, relentless. You embarrassed me. You embarrassed this family. I don't give a damn what kind of man you think you are right now. You're nothing, you hear me? Nothing. The words landed harder than any headline, sharper than any news anchor's condemnation, more piercing than Monique's parting glance. They echoed in his skull, reverberating through the hollow spaces where his pride had once lived. Maybe it's better this way, his father continued, his voice now tinged with a weary disgust. Maybe you needed this. Maybe you needed to finally feel what it's like to be on the other side of that badge, to be the one looking up, not down. Travis's breath hitched, his fingers curling into fists so tight his nails dug into his palms. His father had never spoken to him like this, never stripped him bare with such brutal precision. Before he could muster a response, the line went dead, the abrupt click a final severing of the tether between them. He stared at the phone, hands shaking, the world around him blurring into a haze. The walls seemed to inch closer, the air growing thinner, harder to breathe. For the first time in his life, he felt small, not just diminished, but insignificant, a speck in the vast, uncaring expanse of his own failures. Another buzz snapped him back, another message lighting up the screen. He wasn't sure why he looked. Maybe some flicker of desperate hope still burned in him, a longing for a lifeline from someone, anyone, who didn't see him as a pariah. But when he opened it, his stomach twisted into a knot, an unknown number, a single line. You should watch your back. His breath caught, his eyes darting to the window. The street below stretched out in the dim glow of sodium lights, and there, parked across from his building, sat a black car, still, silent, ominous. Panic surged through him, a cold wave that flooded his veins and set his pulse racing. This wasn't just about losing his career anymore, or his name, or his family's respect. This was about survival. The badge that had once been his armor was gone, leaving him exposed, vulnerable. A man who'd made too many enemies, crossed too many lines. The people he'd wronged, the ones he'd stepped on to climb higher, they were out there, watching, waiting. And now, stripped of his power, he was nothing more than prey. Justice, he realized, wasn't just a word thrown around in courtrooms or newsrooms. It was a force, relentless and unyielding. And it had come for him, not with a gavel or a headline, but with the quiet, creeping dread of consequences he could no longer escape. He'd abused the authority he'd been given, wielded it like a weapon without thought, and now the scales were tipping back, heavy with the weight of his own reckoning. The lesson burned through him, bitter and clear. Power without accountability was a hollow throne, and those who sat on it too long would inevitably fall. In the stillness of a dimly lit apartment, where the blinds hung crookedly, letting in slivers of pale streetlight, Travis Holt sat motionless. The television droned on in the background, its faint hum a constant companion he no longer registered. Once he'd been a man who strode through life with unshakable confidence, a hunter who bent the world to his will. Now he was the prey, cornered by shadows he'd created himself. The walls seemed to lean inward, heavy with the oppressive weight of his unraveling life. His chest tightened, each breath a reminder of everything he'd lost. Not just his job, his badge, his pension, or the name that once carried weight, but something deeper, the unshakable belief that he was untouchable. That illusion had crumbled slowly at first, creeping in like a cold draft through cracks he hadn't noticed. It started with the unanswered calls, the sudden silence from colleagues, his so-called brothers in blue, who'd vanished as swiftly as rats fleeing a sinking ship, eager to escape the taint of his disgrace. Now the truth roared in his ears, undeniable and suffocating. The consequences weren't just ideas anymore. They were here, tangible, pressing down on him like a physical force. A single text message burned in his memory. "You should watch your back." He'd spent years wielding power like a shield, convinced it made him invincible. How naive he'd been. That power had only painted a target on his back, and the enemies he'd made, oh, they remembered. He'd built his career on control, on the unshakable belief that authority was his to command and fear was his to wield. Now that same fear coiled around him, slithering into his bones. He double-checked the locks, his hands trembling slightly as he fumbled with the deadbolt. He peered through the blinds, his eyes darting to every shadow that flickered outside. Vulnerability was a foreign weight, one he'd never carried before, and it sank into him, deep and relentless. Travis hadn't left the apartment in days. When he finally did, his movements betrayed him. No longer the proud, swaggering gait of a man who owned every room he entered, but the cautious shuffle of someone waiting for the ice beneath his feet to crack. He felt the shift in the air around him, the way people's gazes lingered too long, their faces masks of judgment, or worse, apathy. Once he'd been a figure of authority, a name that demanded respect. Now he was a cautionary tale whispered in hushed tones, a story of how swiftly the mighty could tumble into oblivion. And then there was Monique Thompson. She hadn't needed to say a word about him after that night when she'd stood on his doorstep, her presence alone a quiet indictment. The world had already judged him, and she had bigger wars to wage. But Travis had watched her from afar, unable to look away. She moved through the chaos with a grace he'd never possessed, her every step deliberate, her eyes blazing with purpose. What he'd done to her, what he'd allowed the system to do, hadn't broken her. Instead, she'd taken the shards of his downfall and forged them into something greater. New policies had sprung from her resolve, reforms to dismantle the corruption he'd once embodied, to ensure no one else would endure what she had in that courtroom. She hadn't just let the system swallow him whole and move on. She'd turned it into a reckoning, a mirror held up to men like him. The more he observed, the more a truth he'd long ignored clawed its way to the surface. Monique hadn't triumphed because she held power. She'd won because she had something he'd never grasped. Respect earned through integrity, a purpose that outshone his hollow authority. His father's words echoed in his mind, sharp and cutting. "You're nothing now." And maybe, just maybe, that emptiness was the only lens through which he could finally see. Days bled into weeks. The threats didn't stop. Anonymous calls, cryptic notes slipped under his door, but the sharp edge of fear began to dull, replaced by a weary resignation. He had no allies left, no future to cling to. His once loyal colleagues had scattered, their loyalty as fleeting as smoke. Even his old partner, Jimmy, a wiry man with a quick laugh and a quicker temper, had stopped returning his texts, his silence a betrayal that stung deeper than Travis cared to admit. But amid the wreckage, a choice flickered to life. He could fade into the void, a forgotten name erased by time, or he could confront the man he'd been. For the first time, he chose not out of a need to dominate or manipulate, but out of something raw and unfamiliar. Accountability. It began modestly, with no fanfare or calculated theatrics. He drafted a statement, his hands unsteady as he typed the words on a cracked laptop screen. What I did was wrong. There's no excuse for it. I abused my position, and I have to live with the consequences. He sent it to a local news outlet, not expecting much. The world barely blinked. His fall had stripped him of relevance, and the news cycle had long since moved on to fresher scandals. But that wasn't the point. For once he wasn't running, wasn't hiding behind the badge that had once defined him. Then came the harder step. He reached out to the groups he'd once scorned, the activists he'd dismissed as bleeding hearts out to vilify cops. He showed up to their meetings, a hulking figure in a folding chair, his broad shoulders hunched and his eyes fixed on the floor. The room buzzed with tension. Men and women whose lives had been scarred by officers like him, their voices trembling with grief or hardened by rage. There was Carla, a mother whose son had been gunned down in a traffic stop gone wrong, her hands clenched into fists as she spoke. There was Marcus, a quiet man with a scar snaking across his cheek, who recounted years of harassment with a steady, unflinching gaze. Travis didn't speak much at first. What could he say to these people, whose fathers, sons, daughters, and brothers had been stolen by the very system he'd upheld? But he kept coming back, week after week, listening as their stories carved into him like a knife. Slowly, painfully, he began to see the wreckage he'd left behind. Not just in Monique's life, not just in his own, but in every soul crushed beneath the weight of unchecked power. Would it ever be enough? No. Would they ever forgive him? Probably not. Forgiveness wasn't the goal, and he knew he didn't deserve it. But for the first time, Travis Holt wasn't cloaking himself in the armor of his former life. He was exposed, raw, and maybe, just maybe, that meant something. Meanwhile, Monique Thompson pressed forward, unbroken and unbowed. The attack that had once threatened to shatter her had instead forged her into something stronger. Her policies passed, her work rippled outward, touching lives she'd never meet. She didn't speak of Travis again. Why would she? His name lingered not as a man, but as a symbol, a warning etched into the collective memory. He became the lesson whispered in precincts and courtrooms. Justice could find even those who'd long danced beyond its reach. And so the tale closes, not with redemption, not with absolution, but with something far more potent: consequences. Travis Holt's story lays bare a truth as old as time. Power, when left unchecked, festers into abuse. Fear, mistaken for respect, builds a house of cards destined to collapse. When the world finally calls you to account, no badge, no title, no system can shield you from the fallout. Monique's victory wasn't in her vengeance, but in her refusal to let the cycle continue. Travis's reckoning wasn't in his punishment, but in his awakening. Together they stand as proof that justice isn't just a gavel's strike or a cell's clang. It's the slow, inevitable tide that washes away the illusions of the mighty, leaving only truth in its wake. The air inside the store was thick with the scent of polished mahogany and supple, expensive leather, a rich aroma that seemed to cling to every surface as Jamal stepped through the glass doors. His worn sneakers let out a faint squeak against the gleaming tiled floor, a sound so soft it was nearly drowned out by the low hum of hushed voices and the smooth, jazzy notes drifting from hidden speakers. For a moment he paused just inside the threshold, his breath catching in his chest as he took in the overwhelming elegance of the place. Crystal-clear glass cases lined the walls, their contents, watches with intricate faces, glittering jewelry and accessories that whispered of privilege, bathed in the warm glow of golden lights. It was a world apart from the one he knew, and he felt the difference in the way his heart thudded nervously against his ribs. His fingers fidgeted with the hem of his faded hoodie, brushing against the envelope of cash tucked into his pocket. Money he'd scraped together over months of late-night shifts and skipped meals. This wasn't his scene, not by a long shot, but he squared his shoulders with quiet resolve. His mom's birthday was coming up, and after all she'd sacrificed, she deserved something beautiful, something that reflected even a fraction of her worth. He'd come too far to back out now. As he moved deeper into the store, his eyes darted around, drinking in the details. The way the light danced off the polished surfaces, the faint clink of a champagne glass from a corner where two well-dressed shoppers chatted, the subtle rustle of silk as someone brushed past. He felt small, out of place, like a smudge on a pristine canvas. But he pushed the thought aside and approached a display of watches. His gaze landed on a delicate silver timepiece, its mother-of-pearl face shimmering like a tiny captured moon. It was perfect, simple, yet stunning, the kind of gift that would make his mom's eyes light up with that rare, unguarded smile he lived for. Perfect, he murmured under his breath, picturing her unwrapping it, her tired hands pausing as she realized what he'd done for her. He leaned closer, his breath fogging the glass for a split second, when a sharp voice sliced through his reverie. "Can I help you?" The words were crisp, edged with something Jamal couldn't quite place. He turned to see a man in a tailored navy suit standing a few feet away, arms crossed over his chest like a barrier. The man's face was a mask, cool, composed, but with a hardness in his eyes that made Jamal's stomach twist. "Oh, I was just looking at this watch," Jamal said, nodding toward the display, his voice softer than he'd intended. The man's gaze didn't waver. "Those are quite expensive," he replied, his tone carrying a pointed weight, as if the words were meant to push Jamal back toward the door. "Are you sure you're in the right place?" The question hung in the air, heavy and deliberate. Jamal blinked, caught off guard, his mind scrambling for a response. "Yeah, I'm sure," he said, forcing the words out. "I'm here to buy a gift for my mom." The man's eyes flicked downward, taking in Jamal's hoodie, his slightly frayed jeans, his scuffed sneakers, before settling back on his face. "Right," he drawled, the word dripping with skepticism. "Well, let me know if you need anything." He didn't move, though, just stood there, watching as Jamal turned to another display, his presence like a shadow that wouldn't lift. Jamal tried to focus on the watches again, running his fingers along the edge of his pocket where the cash sat, a tangible reminder of why he was here. But his palms were growing slick with sweat, his chest tight with a discomfort he couldn't shake. He hadn't done anything wrong, hadn't even touched the merchandise, but the man's stare made him feel like a thief caught red-handed. He took a deep breath, willing himself to stay calm, when another voice broke in, this one younger, sharper. "Can I see your hands, please?" Jamal turned to find a second employee, a wiry guy with a buzz cut and a crisp shirt, approaching from the other side of the store. "What?" Jamal frowned, confusion creasing his brow. "Your hands," the man repeated, nodding toward Jamal's pockets with a clipped impatience. "We need to make sure you're not concealing anything." Heat flooded Jamal's face, a rush of embarrassment and anger that made his ears ring. "I didn't take anything," he said, his voice rising slightly. "I'm just looking." The younger man's lips twitched into a faint smirk, as if Jamal's protest was exactly what he'd expected. "Then you won't mind showing me your hands," he pressed. "Are you serious right now?" Jamal's voice cracked, disbelief spilling out as he yanked his hands from his hoodie pocket and held them up. They trembled slightly, empty and open, proof of his innocence laid bare. The younger employee's smirk deepened, a glint of satisfaction in his eyes. "We've had incidents before," he said, his tone almost casual, like this was routine. "Shoplifting, you know." Jamal's throat tightened, the word hitting him like a slap. "You think I'm trying to steal something?" he asked, his voice barely holding steady. "Calm down," the man replied, waving a hand dismissively. "We're just doing our job." But the room felt smaller now, the air heavier. Jamal noticed heads turning, shoppers in tailored coats and designer scarves glancing his way, their whispers curling through the air like smoke. A woman in a sleek blazer murmured something to her friend, who shot Jamal a quick, disapproving look before shaking his head. The walls seemed to press in, the golden lights suddenly too bright, too accusing. "I don't want any trouble," Jamal muttered, stepping back, his hands still half raised. I just wanted to buy something. The older man in the suit reappeared, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. Sir, we take security very seriously here. If you don't intend to purchase anything, I'll have to ask you to leave. Jamal's frustration flared, hot and sharp. I do want to buy something, he said, louder now, his voice trembling with a mix of anger and shame. He pointed at the silver watch. That one. I want to buy it. The man's eyebrow arched, skepticism etched into every line of his face. That's a $2,500 piece, he said, as if testing Jamal's resolve. I know, Jamal shot back, pulling the envelope from his pocket with a defiant tug. I have the money right here. The bills were crisp, carefully counted, a testament to months of sacrifice. The man's eyes flicked to the envelope, but his expression didn't soften. Instead, he exchanged a quick, knowing glance with the younger employee. This is ridiculous, Jamal said, his voice shaking as he clutched the envelope tighter. I didn't do anything wrong. The older man straightened, his tone firm and unyielding. Sir, if you continue raising your voice, I'll have no choice but to call the authorities. Jamal froze, the word authorities echoing in his ears like a gunshot. I'm calling now, the younger employee added, already reaching for his phone with a practiced ease. Wait, what? Jamal stepped forward, hands up in a desperate plea. You don't have to do that. Please, I didn't do anything. The commotion swelled, drawing more eyes, shoppers craning their necks, their murmurs growing louder, sharper. Why would he even come in here dressed like that? One voice hissed. Probably up to no good, another replied. Shameful. The words stung, each one a needle pricking at Jamal's resolve. Tears burned at the corners of his eyes, hot and insistent, but he blinked them back, refusing to let them fall. He hadn't done anything wrong, not a single thing. Minutes later, the heavy thud of boots announced the arrival of 2 police officers, their uniforms stark against the store's polished elegance. The crowd fell silent, the air thick with anticipation as one officer stepped forward. What's the situation? He asked, his voice steady but clipped. The older man in the suit responded smoothly, gesturing toward Jamal. This young man was behaving suspiciously around our merchandise. He's been asked to leave multiple times, but refuses. That's not true! Jamal burst out, his voice raw with desperation. I was just looking! The officer turned to him, his face neutral but his eyes hard. Son, do you have any ID on you? Jamal hesitated, his heart sinking. I didn't bring my wallet, he admitted, cursing himself for the oversight. Convenient, the older man muttered under his breath, just loud enough for Jamal to hear. What's that supposed to mean? Jamal snapped, his frustration boiling over. Let's take this outside, the officer said, placing a firm hand on Jamal's shoulder. The touch made him flinch, his chest tightening until he could barely breathe. Please, he whispered, his voice breaking. I just wanted to buy a gift for my mom. Before the officer could respond, a commanding voice rang out across the store, slicing through the tension like a thunderclap. What's going on here? All heads turned toward the entrance, where a tall, sharply dressed man strode in, his presence filling the room. Christopher, Jamal's father, moved with a purpose, his polished shoes clicking against the tiles, his face a storm of barely contained fury. The older man in the suit blinked, momentarily thrown off balance. Are you with him? He asked, his voice faltering. I'm his father, Christopher replied, his words sharp enough to cut through steel. And you'd better have a damn good explanation for why my son is surrounded by cops. The air shifted, the officers exchanging uneasy glances as they registered Christopher's commanding presence. One of them squinted, recognition dawning. Wait a minute, he started, but Christopher ignored him, his focus zeroing in on Jamal. Jamal, he said, his voice softening for the first time, a lifeline in the chaos. Are you okay? Jamal's walls crumbled, tears streaming down his face as he shook his head. I didn't do anything, Dad. I swear. Christopher's jaw tightened as he turned back to the employees, his eyes blazing. I'm going to need an explanation. Now. In that moment, the scene became a stark lesson in justice, or the lack of it. Jamal had walked in with hope, his heart full of love for his mom, only to be met with suspicion and scorn, his every move twisted by the weight of unspoken assumptions. The employees, cloaked in their authority, had wielded their power carelessly, letting prejudice guide their actions instead of reason. The consequences of that abuse rippled outward. Humiliation for Jamal, anger for Christopher, and a quiet, uncomfortable reckoning for the onlookers who'd judged from the sidelines. It was a reminder that power, unchecked, could crush the innocent, and that true justice demanded more than blind adherence to rules. It required humanity, something this glittering store had forgotten in its pursuit of exclusivity. The air in the upscale store thickened with tension, a palpable shift rippling through the space as power dynamics tilted like a seesaw caught mid-motion. The silence was suffocating, a heavy shroud that pressed against every corner of the room, amplifying the sound of shallow breaths and nervous shuffling. Every pair of eyes, customers, employees, even the police officers locked onto Christopher Banks, whose towering figure seemed to swallow the light itself. His broad shoulders squared, his jaw set like stone, he stood as an immovable force, radiating authority that made the polished marble floor beneath him feel insignificant. Beside him, his 16-year-old son Jamal clung to his shadow, his thin frame trembling like a leaf caught in a storm. Relief flickered in Jamal's dark eyes, though. Gratitude that his father had stormed in like a tidal wave to sweep away the chaos threatening to drown him. Christopher's voice sliced through the stillness, steady as a blade but carrying a sharpness that hinted at the fury simmering beneath. "Let me get this straight," he began, his tone deceptively calm, each word measured yet brimming with an edge that could cut glass. "You're accusing my son of stealing?" His gaze bore into the older employee, a wiry man with graying hair who fumbled with his tie as if it were strangling him. The man's bravado, once puffed up like a peacock, deflated under Christopher's scrutiny, his fingers twitching as he adjusted the knot at his throat. "Sir," he stammered, his voice cracking like thin ice. "It's not personal. We've had incidents before. We have protocols." "Protocols?" Christopher echoed, his interruption swift and cold, a verbal slap that made the older man flinch. "And do these protocols involve dragging a young man through the mud just because of the way he looks?" His eyes flicked to the younger employee, a lanky kid barely out of his 20s, who'd opened his mouth to interject but froze when Christopher's piercing stare pinned him in place. "Banks," Christopher supplied coolly, filling the silence the kid couldn't. "Christopher Banks. I assume you've caught one or two of my films?" Recognition sparked in the younger employee's wide eyes, his freckled face paling as his jaw hung slack, words evaporating before they could form. "Thought so," Christopher said, folding his arms across his chest, the motion slow and deliberate, exuding a quiet menace. "But let's not waste time talking about me. Let's talk about how my son, a paying customer, walked in here with cash in his pocket to buy his mother a gift and ended up with police breathing down his neck. Explain that." The officer who'd been hovering near Jamal, one hand still resting on the boy's shoulder moments ago, took a cautious step forward. His uniform creaked faintly, the sound swallowed by the tension. "Mr. Banks," he said, his voice tentative, like he was testing the waters of a boiling sea. "I think there's been a misunderstanding. We were called because—" "Because what?" Christopher cut in, his voice rising just enough to make the officer's Adam's apple bob nervously. "Because someone decided my son didn't belong here? Because he wasn't strutting around in a tailored suit or flashing a gold credit card? Tell me, officer, did it cross your mind to ask these fine gentlemen why they pegged a 16-year-old kid as a thief before you swooped in to cuff him?" The officer shifted his weight, boots scuffing the floor, his discomfort radiating like heat. "Sir," he mumbled, "we're just responding to the store's concerns." "And those concerns," Christopher snapped, his voice cracking like a whip through the air, Are based on what exactly? The shade of his skin? The hoodie he's wearing? What about my son screamed criminal to you? The silence that followed stretched taut, a wire ready to snap. The officers exchanged fleeting glances, their faces a mix of unease and indecision. The older employee cleared his throat, a raspy sound that grated against the quiet, as he tried to claw back some semblance of control. "Mr. Banks," he began, his tone syrupy with forced politeness. "We're a high-end establishment. It's not unusual for us to keep a close eye on customers. Unfortunately, some individuals, Christopher fired back, his words sharp enough to draw blood. "You mean young black boys like my son?" The man's face flushed crimson, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. No, of course not," he sputtered, sweat beading on his forehead. "We don't discriminate. We have policies." "Policies that only seem to apply to people who look like my son," Christopher retorted, his voice icy, each syllable dripping with disdain. "Let me ask you something. Did you shadow every single person who strolled through those doors today? Or just the kid in sneakers?" Beside him, Jamal stood mute, the weight of dozens of stares pressing down on him like a physical force. His throat tightened, a lump swelling as whispers slithered through the crowd. "It's so dramatic," a woman in a sleek coat muttered to her friend, her voice low but cutting. "If the boy wasn't guilty, why'd they call the cops?" Jamal's head snapped toward her, his voice trembling as it broke free. "I didn't steal anything," he said, the words raw and jagged. "I was just trying to buy a watch for my mom." The woman blinked, startled, her lips parting as if to reply, but she shrank back under the heat of his gaze. Christopher's hand landed on Jamal's shoulder, firm and grounding, a silent anchor in the storm. "You don't owe her an explanation, son," he said softly, then turned his attention back to the employees, his tone hardening again. "This humiliation stops right now." The older employee straightened, his unease morphing into a brittle defensiveness. "Sir," he said, his voice tight, "I assure you we didn't intend to humiliate anyone. Our job is to protect our merchandise. And your merchandise needed protection from my son?" Christopher's tone was laced with bitter irony, his eyes narrowing. "Not from that guy in the three-piece suit over there, or the lady with the $1,000 handbag, just the 16-year-old who dared to walk into your precious store?" The younger employee piped up, his voice strained, almost pleading. "Sir, if you're suggesting we discriminated against your son—" "I'm not suggesting anything," Christopher shot back, his words a thunderclap. "I'm stating it plain and simple. This whole mess is a product of your prejudice, and I'm going to make damn sure everyone knows it." The younger employee's face drained of color, his hands fidgeting at his sides. "Mr. Banks, please," he said, desperation creeping in. "Let's not blow this out of proportion." "Blow this out of proportion?" Christopher repeated, his voice swelling with incredulity, shaking the air. "You called the police on a child. You humiliated him in front of a crowd, and now you want to brush it off because you figured out who I am?" Jamal, finding his courage at last, stepped forward, his voice quivering but resolute. "They didn't even let me explain, Dad. They just assumed I was stealing." Christopher's expression softened for a fleeting moment as he looked at his son, pain flickering in his eyes. "I know, Jamal," he said quietly, "and they're going to pay for it." The younger employee spun toward the officers, panic flashing in his gaze. "Officers, surely we can clear this up. Mr. Banks doesn't need to involve—" "Oh, I'm involving everyone," Christopher said, his voice dropping to a deadly calm that sent a shiver through the room. "The media, social justice groups, my lawyers, you name it. This isn't going anywhere but straight to the spotlight." The officers hesitated, their discomfort palpable, one of them rubbing the back of his neck. "Mr. Banks," he ventured, "if you'd like to file a formal complaint—" "I'll be filing more than a complaint," Christopher cut in, his words ringing with finality. "I'll make sure every news outlet in this country hears about this." The older employee edged closer, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "Mr. Banks, Perhaps we can settle this privately. No need to turn it into a circus. Christopher's laugh was sharp and humorless, a sound that echoed off the pristine walls. A circus? You turned this into a circus the moment you called the cops on my son for daring to exist in your store. You made it a spectacle when you decided his presence threatened your fancy little world. Don't tell me not to make a scene. Jamal tugged at his father's sleeve, his voice small and shaky. Dad, can we just go? I don't want to be here anymore. Christopher paused, his fierce demeanor softening as he met his son's pleading eyes. You don't deserve this, he murmured, his hand squeezing Jamal's shoulder. None of this is your fault. I know, Jamal whispered, his voice barely audible, but I just want to leave. Christopher nodded, a reluctant sigh escaping him, but his gaze swung back to the employees, cold and unyielding. We're leaving, he said, his tone low and menacing. But this isn't over. As he turned to guide Jamal toward the exit, one of the officers called after him, his voice tentative. Mr. Banks, we'll file a report about today if you need to contact us. I won't need to, Christopher replied without breaking stride, his back a wall of resolve. Trust me, the whole world's going to hear about this. They stepped out into the blinding sunlight, the glass doors swinging shut behind them with a soft thud. Jamal kept his head down, the weight of whispers and stares trailing them like a ghost. Tears stung his eyes, but he blinked them back, focusing on the warmth of his father's hand on his shoulder. Outside, the air felt lighter, but the sting of injustice lingered, a bitter taste that neither of them could shake. This wasn't just a moment of humiliation. It was a glaring lesson in justice, a raw reminder of how power could be twisted to crush the innocent. Christopher's fury wasn't merely personal. It was a stand against a system that too often wielded authority like a blunt weapon, leaving scars on those least equipped to bear them. For Jamal, the day etched a deeper truth into his young soul, that even the simplest acts, like buying a gift, could be warped by suspicion, and that the consequences of unchecked power could ripple far beyond a single store's walls. The biting wind slapped against Jamal's cheeks, a harsh and unrelenting force that seemed to mock the icy shame twisting in his gut. He knelt there on the pavement, the rough concrete digging into his knees, his breath shaky as the weight of the moment pressed down on him. Before him stood Christopher, his father, a towering figure whose hands clamped onto Jamal's shoulders with a grip that was both firm and tender, a lifeline in the storm of emotions swirling inside the boy. Jamal, Christopher said, his voice cutting through the wind with a calm, unshakable strength. Listen to me, son. I'm proud of you. Do you hear that? Not a single piece of this mess is your fault. Don't you dare let them shrink you down to nothing. Jamal's head bobbed in a faint nod, but the dam holding back his tears finally crumbled. Hot streaks carved paths down his face as he choked out. I just wanted to do something nice for Mom. His voice cracked, fragile and raw, the confession of a boy who'd only meant to bring a smile to someone he loved. Christopher didn't hesitate. He yanked Jamal into a fierce hug, wrapping his arms around him like a shield against the world's cruelty. I know, son, he murmured, his tone softening into something warm and soothing. And you did. You stood tall out there, taller than they'll ever manage. That's something they can't take from you. The sting of the incident didn't stay confined to that moment. Within hours, a shaky video captured by a stranger's phone exploded across the internet, the confrontation laid bare for all to see. By the next morning, the digital world was ablaze with hashtags. #justice, for Jamal, #racial profiling, each one a flare lighting up the dark corners of injustice. Christopher's email pinged incessantly, flooded with messages from reporters hungry for a soundbite. At the breakfast table, Jamal sat hunched over his phone, scrolling through the endless stream of posts, his cereal growing soggy in the bowl. Dad, he said quietly, his voice barely rising above the hum of the refrigerator. It's everywhere. He paused, his thumb hovering over the screen, then added, Do we have to keep talking about it? Christopher set his steaming coffee mug down with a soft clink and leaned forward, his dark eyes locking onto his son's. I get it, Jamal. This is a lot. It's overwhelming, and I know you didn't sign up for it. But this isn't just our story anymore. People are watching, really watching, and we've got a shot here to show them what's broken in this world. Maybe even fix it. Jamal's gaze dropped to his lap, his fingers tugging nervously at the frayed hem of his hoodie. I didn't ask for any of this, he muttered, the words heavy with exhaustion. Christopher's voice softened, but it carried a quiet resolve. I know you didn't, son, but sometimes the fight picks you, ready or not. A sharp ring from the doorbell sliced through their conversation. Christopher rose, his chair scraping against the tile, and returned moments later clutching a thick manila envelope. They move fast, he grumbled, tossing it onto the table with a thud. Jamal's brow furrowed. What's that? Christopher slid the envelope open, revealing a crisp legal notice from the store. An apology, he said, his lip curling slightly as he read, and a settlement to resolve things amicably. He held up a check for $25,000, letting it dangle between his fingers before scoffing, as if a stack of cash wipes away what they did. Jamal's frown deepened, his voice sharp with disbelief. They think this is done just because they threw money at it? Exactly, Christopher replied, a flicker of pride dancing in his eyes. But it's not over. Not until the whole rotten system gets torn down. Later that day, Christopher sat in a sleek, high-rise office, the city sprawling out below through floor-to-ceiling windows. Across from him was Grace, his lawyer, a woman with sharp eyes that seemed to pierce through lies and a no-nonsense demeanor honed by a decade of fighting civil rights battles. She tapped her laptop with a manicured nail, a faint smirk tugging at her lips. The store manager's past is a gold mine, she said, her voice brimming with anticipation. We dug up photos from his college days, marches, rallies, the kind of stuff that doesn't exactly scream equality for all. Christopher leaned in, his curiosity piqued. You're saying he was in a white supremacist group? Grace tilted her head, choosing her words carefully. Not officially, no, but those pictures? They don't leave much room for doubt about where his heart was. And it's not just him. Employees are starting to talk. Anonymously, of course. They're painting a picture of a store steeped in racial bias, top to bottom. Christopher nodded slowly, his mind racing as a plan took shape. This isn't just about Jamal anymore, he said, his voice low and determined. It's about every kid who's been sized up like a thief the second they step through a door. We've got to drag all of this into the light. Grace's smile widened, a glint of admiration in her eyes. That's why I stick with you, Christopher. You don't just see the battle, you see the war. Back at home, Jamal sprawled across the couch, a game controller in his hands as he tried to drown out the world with pixelated explosions and pounding music. But even the chaos on the screen couldn't block the flood of notifications lighting up his phone. Texts from friends, DMs from strangers, even a gruff but kind message from his basketball coach. His mom, Lena, eased down beside him, her presence soft and steady like a lighthouse in a storm. Hey, she said gently, resting a hand on his arm. How you holding up? Jamal shrugged, his eyes fixed on the TV, the controller clicking under his thumbs. Everyone keeps asking me that. Lena's voice stayed warm, unwavering. That's because they care about you. But it's okay if you don't have an answer. This is a lot to carry. Too much for anyone, especially a kid your age. Jamal sighed, letting the controller slip from his hands to the cushion. I just feel like everything's different now. People don't see me anymore. Just that kid from the video. Lena's grip tightened on his shoulder, her tone fierce but loving. You're still you, Jamal. Don't let them steal that from you. He hesitated, then turned to her, his voice small. Do you think Dad's right about making this bigger? Lena paused, her eyes searching his face before she answered. Your dad fights because he can't stand the thought of anyone else going through what you did, but if you're not ready to charge into that fight, that's okay too. No one's asking you to be anyone but Jamal. Her words settled over him, soft and comforting, like the quilt she'd draped over him during thunderstorms when he was little. The following week, Christopher stood on the courthouse steps, a sea of reporters, activists, and supporters stretching out before him. Signs bobbed in the crowd. Hashtag Justice for Jamal. End racial profiling, their bold letters a testament to the growing fire. Jamal lingered at his side, shifting his weight from foot to foot, trying to tune out the click of cameras and the murmur of voices. Christopher's voice boomed through the microphone, steady and commanding. This isn't just about one boy in one store. This is about a system that sizes people up by the shade of their skin before they even get a chance to speak. It's about a culture that's taught us some lives matter less. And that ends now. The crowd roared, applause crashing like waves, and though Jamal squirmed under the attention, he couldn't ignore the electricity in his father's words. Afterward, a journalist with a notepad and a relentless stare cornered Jamal. "How does it feel to be the face of this movement?" she asked, her pen poised. Jamal froze, words tangling in his throat, but Christopher stepped in, smooth as ever. "My son's strong, stronger than most, but he's also 16. Let's not forget he's still a kid trying to find his way in a world that's done him wrong." The journalist nodded, backing off, but Jamal's chest tightened with guilt. Strong? He didn't feel it, not even close. That night, Christopher sat in his study, papers scattered across the desk like fallen leaves. A soft knock pulled him from his thoughts, and Jamal slipped inside, his hands fidgeting. "Hey, Dad," he said, his voice tentative. "Can we talk?" Christopher set his work aside, his full attention on his son. "Always, Jamal. What's on your mind?" Jamal took a deep breath, the words tumbling out. "I'm proud of what you're doing, I am. But I don't think I'm like you. I don't know how to be brave like that." Christopher's face softened, a rare vulnerability breaking through his usual steel. "Jamal, bravery isn't about speeches or cameras. It's about holding on to who you are when everything's trying to rip it away. You've already done that. You're braver than you know." Jamal's throat tightened, his eyes dropping to the floor. "It doesn't feel like enough." "It is," Christopher said, his voice firm but kind. "And if you ever want to do more, you'll find your way. But right now, just be Jamal, that's plenty." The next morning, the news hit like a thunderclap. The store manager had stepped down, buried under a mountain of evidence tying him to racist affiliations from years past. Christopher's team fired off a statement, hammering home the need for deep systemic change, not just a single scapegoat. The story swallowed the headlines, sparking heated debates about racial bias in stores nationwide. Jamal watched it unfold on the TV, a storm of emotions churning inside him. Relief that something was shifting, anger at how long it had taken, pride in his father's unshakable resolve, and a quiet, nagging question about where he fit into it all. The lesson was clear. Justice wasn't a gift handed down. It was a battle fought inch by inch, and the cost of power misused was a debt that could never be paid with a check. Amid the swirling chaos of his life, Jamal felt a flicker of something he hadn't experienced in ages. Hope. It was faint, fragile, like a candle flame trembling in a storm, but it was there, warming a corner of his heart he'd long thought had gone cold. The fallout from the incident at the store had spiraled far beyond anything he could have imagined. In the days that followed, morning talk shows buzzed with hosts picking apart the grainy security footage frame by frame, their voices sharp and eager. Social media erupted into a chaotic sea of opinions. Hashtags trending, long-winded think pieces flooding timelines, and heated debates spilling over into every corner of the internet. For a while, it seemed the world couldn't look away. But as the weeks dragged on, the spotlight began to dim. The public's attention, once laser-focused on Jamal's story, scattered like leaves in the wind, chased off by the next big headline. Life, it turned out, didn't pause for anyone. Not even for him. At school, Jamal couldn't escape the ripple effects. Whispers trailed him down the hallways like shadows, soft but persistent. Some kids treated him like a legend, their eyes wide with awe as if he'd single-handedly toppled an empire. Others steered clear, avoiding him as though his sudden infamy might rub off on them like a disease. Even the teachers seemed caught up in the strange drama of it all. They'd single him out in class with praise that felt rehearsed, their words dripping with a performative sincerity that made his skin crawl. One afternoon, his history teacher stopped him after class, holding up his latest essay with a proud smile. "Jamal, your piece on standing up for what's right, it's truly inspiring," she said, her tone overly bright. Thanks," he mumbled, slumping deeper into his chair as the bell rang, its shrill chime a merciful escape. He could feel the weight of her gaze lingering on him, expectant, like she wanted him to say more, to perform the role of the brave kid they all seemed to think he was. Out in the hallway, his best friend Marco caught up to him, weaving through the crowd with his usual easy grin. "Man, you've got them all spooked," Marco teased, nudging him with an elbow. "They're acting like you're about to go live on TV and call out every single one of them." Jamal forced a smile, his lips twitching upward, but the effort felt hollow. He didn't have the energy to play along. Marco's grin faltered, his voice softening as he studied his friend's face. "You good, though?" Jamal hesitated, his shoulders lifting in a half-hearted shrug. "It's just, everyone's acting so weird. I don't even know how to talk to people anymore." Marco nodded, his dark eyes thoughtful. "Yeah, I get it. But they'll chill out eventually. Just give it time." Time, Jamal thought bitterly. He wasn't sure he had that kind of patience, or if he even believed it would fix anything. Back at home, the air buzzed with a different kind of energy. His father, Christopher, was a whirlwind of activity, swept up in a storm of meetings with activists, late-night phone calls with reporters, and tense strategy sessions with his lawyer. It was as if the world had handed him a megaphone, and he was determined to use it. Jamal sprawled on the living room couch, aimlessly flipping through TV channels, the flickering lights casting shadows across his face. His mom stepped into the room, her footsteps soft against the hardwood floor, and sank onto the cushion beside him. "Your dad's in the office again," she said with a small, tired smile. "I swear he's trying to save the world before breakfast tomorrow." Jamal let out a quiet sigh, the corner of his mouth twitching. "Yeah, that sounds like him." She turned to him, her eyes searching his face in that gentle, knowing way she had. "You've been quiet lately. Want to talk?" He shook his head, the words sticking in his throat. "I'm fine." She didn't press him, but she stayed there, her presence a steady warmth that wrapped around him like a blanket. It wasn't a fix, but it was enough for now. A week later, the store issued another statement, their words polished and carefully crafted. They promised sweeping changes, mandatory bias training for every employee, a hefty donation to a civil rights group, and the hiring of some fancy diversity consultant. When Grace, one of Christopher's activist friends, called to discuss it, her voice crackled with skepticism. "It's damage control," she said flatly. "They're just scrambling to save face." Christopher's response came sharp and firm. "Good, let them scramble." But Jamal wasn't so convinced. He sat at the kitchen table scrolling through the statement on his phone, his brow furrowed. The promises felt hollow, like a shiny coat of paint slapped over a crumbling wall. Over dinner that night, he glanced at his father, his voice tentative. "Do you think they mean it?" Christopher set his fork down, his expression hard. "They mean it as much as they have to. Real change takes more than a press release, Jamal. That's why we keep pushing." Jamal nodded, but the words didn't settle the unease gnawing at him. He stayed quiet, poking at his food as his thoughts churned. One evening, as Christopher prepared for yet another media appearance, Jamal hovered near the doorway to his father's study. The room was a mess of papers and coffee mugs, the desk lamp casting a harsh glow over Christopher's furrowed brow. "You ready to be famous again?" Jamal asked, his tone light but laced with a quiet ache he couldn't name. Christopher looked up from his notes, a tired smile breaking across his face. "This isn't about fame, son." "I know," Jamal said quickly, shifting his weight. But doesn't it ever get exhausting? Fighting all the time? Christopher leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking under him. It does, but it's worth it. Every step we take makes it harder for the next person to ignore what's wrong. Jamal chewed on that for a moment before asking, his voice softer, "What about when people stop paying attention?" Christopher's smile faded, his eyes growing distant. That's the hard part. People move on. But that doesn't mean we stop. Even when no one's watching, the fight goes on. Those words lodged themselves in Jamal's mind, heavy and unyielding, and he carried them with him long after he left the room. A few days later, Marco dragged him to the mall, insisting they hunt down a pair of sneakers. "I don't know why you're so obsessed with these," Jamal grumbled, watching Marco inspect a pair of high tops with the intensity of a jeweler appraising a diamond. "They look like every other shoe you own." Marco grinned, undeterred. "Because these are the ones I don't have yet." As they stepped out of the shop, bags in hand, Jamal's gaze drifted across the corridor. And there it was. The store. The memory crashed into him like a tidal wave, sharp and unrelenting. Marco followed his stare, his voice dropping. "You okay?" "Yeah," Jamal said too quickly, turning away. "Let's go." But as they walked, he couldn't resist glancing back. A new manager stood at the entrance, smiling at customers with practiced ease. Something about it pulled at him, tugging him to a stop. "Hold up," he said, turning on his heel. Marco frowned, alarmed. "You're not going in there, are you?" Jamal didn't answer. His heart thudded in his chest as he crossed the threshold, stepping back into the place that had turned his life upside down. The new manager greeted him with a bright, "Welcome. Let me know if I can help you with anything." Jamal nodded, his throat tight, and wandered deeper into the store. The aisles stretched out before him, unchanged, the same gleaming displays, the same faint scent of wealth hanging in the air. Yet something felt different, a subtle shift he couldn't quite pin down. He stopped at the watch counter, the same spot where it had all begun. The silver watch still sat there, its face catching the light, mocking him with its quiet perfection. "Looking for something special?" the manager asked, approaching with a friendly tilt of his head. Jamal hesitated, the words catching in his throat. "No, just looking." The man nodded and drifted away, leaving Jamal alone with the hum of his own thoughts. That night, he told Christopher about it, his voice low. "You went back?" his father asked, surprise flickering in his eyes. "Yeah, I don't know. I wanted to see if it felt different." "And did it?" "A little," Jamal admitted. "But it still doesn't feel like enough." Christopher nodded, his gaze steady. "Change takes time, Jamal. What matters is you took that step. Going back, that's brave." Jamal wasn't sure he agreed, but for the first time he felt a tiny spark of agency, a whisper of control over the story that had swallowed him whole. As the months rolled on, the lawsuit trudged forward, a slow grind of legal battles and public scrutiny. Christopher threw himself into it with relentless fire, while Jamal wrestled with quieter doubts, the kind that crept in during the stillness of night. The case settled eventually, hushed and unceremonious. The store coughed up a financial payout, a public apology, and a promise of long-term reforms. For Christopher, it was a triumph. Imperfect, but a step forward. "Change doesn't come from one case," he'd say, his voice firm with conviction. "It comes from persistence, from keeping the pressure on." Jamal wasn't so certain. The media circus had finally packed up and left town, and school was settling back into a fragile normalcy. But the weight of it all still pressed down on him, leaving questions he couldn't always voice. One evening, as the family gathered around the dinner table, Christopher set his phone aside, a rare break from the endless stream of calls and emails. The silence felt thick, almost sacred. Jamal broke it, his voice cutting through the quiet. "I was thinking about what you said. how change takes time. Christopher looked up, nodding slowly. Go on. Jamal took a breath, his thoughts spilling out in a rush. It just feels like, even when we win, it's not over. Like there's always more to fight for. And I don't know if I'm ready for that. His father's eyes softened, a rare glimpse of vulnerability breaking through his armor. None of us are ever fully ready, Jamal, but we keep going, because justice isn't a gift, it's a demand. And the second we stop demanding it, people like them, he jerked his head toward some invisible enemy, they win. Across the table, Jamal's mom reached for his hand, her touch grounding him. Marco's laughter echoed in his mind, a reminder of lighter days. Even Grace, with her sharp tongue and unshakable resolve, lingered in the background of his thoughts, a steady voice in the chaos. They were all part of this, tied together by a moment that had exposed the raw edges of power and privilege. The store might have bent under pressure, but Jamal knew the lesson ran deeper. Justice was a fragile thing, easily warped by those who wielded authority without care. And the consequences of that abuse, they rippled out, touching lives in ways no press release could ever undo. For Jamal, the fight wasn't just about winning. It was about holding that truth close, carrying it forward, even when the world stopped watching. Jamal sat across from Christopher, his brow furrowed with a mix of hope and doubt as he posed the question that had been gnawing at him for weeks. Do you really think we'll ever see it, though? Like, will things actually get better? Not just for us, but for everyone? His voice carried the weight of a young man who'd seen too much too soon, yet still clung to a fragile thread of optimism. Christopher, older and weathered by years of battling the same uncertainties, leaned back in his creaky wooden chair, the faint groan of the furniture echoing in the dimly lit room. He ran a hand over his stubbled chin, his dark eyes narrowing as he mulled over the question with the care of someone who'd learned that words could either heal or wound. Maybe not all at once, he finally said, his tone measured but warm, like a father trying to shield his son from the harsher edges of truth. Change doesn't come crashing in like a tidal wave, Jamal. It's more like a slow drip, steady, persistent. Every little step we take, every stand we make, it's not just for us. It's for the ones who come after. That's what keeps my fire burning even when the world feels cold. Jamal's frown deepened, his fingers fidgeting with the frayed hem of his hoodie. But what if they forget? He pressed, his voice rising slightly with the urgency of his fear. What if people just sweep it all under the rug, act like nothing ever happened, like it doesn't matter? Christopher sighed, a sound heavy with the weight of countless what-ifs. They might, he conceded, leaning forward now, his elbows resting on the scratched tabletop between them. Some folks will always choose the easy road, the one that lets them pretend the cracks aren't there. But that's why we don't let up. Change isn't a straight shot from dark to light, Jamal. It's a messy, winding fight. We keep pushing, keep shouting, keep reminding them. Even if the world doesn't bend as far as we dream, we've still carved out a piece of it that's better because we refuse to stay quiet. Jamal nodded slowly, his eyes dropping to the table as Christopher's words settled into him like rain soaking into dry earth. He didn't have a reply, but the silence between them wasn't empty. It was alive with the promise of something shifting inside him. The following weekend, Christopher's voice cut through the hum of Jamal's thoughts as he stood in the doorway of their cramped living room, a flyer crumpled in his hand. "Come with me tomorrow," he said, his tone firm but laced with an invitation Jamal couldn't refuse. "I'm helping put together something at the community center. It's small, but it matters." Jamal hesitated, his mind flashing to the comfort of his bed and the mindless scroll of his phone, but the look in Christopher's eyes, steady, expectant, pulled him in. The next day they arrived at a modest brick building tucked between a laundromat and a corner store, its faded sign barely legible under the gray March sky. Inside, a handful of folding chairs were scattered across a scuffed linoleum floor, occupied by a mix of teenagers and young adults, their faces a gallery of curiosity and guarded hope. Jamal lingered at the back, his arms crossed tight over his chest, feeling like an outsider peering into a world he wasn't sure he belonged to. The workshop was about navigating bias, how to spot it, how to fight it, how to stand tall when it tried to knock you down. As the facilitator's voice filled the room, punctuated by the occasional squeak of a marker on a whiteboard, Jamal's ears caught fragments of stories spilling from the others. A girl with braided hair spoke of being followed in a store, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and shame. A lanky boy in a basketball jersey described a teacher who'd dismissed him before he'd even opened his mouth. Each word stitched itself into Jamal's chest, threading through his own memories until he realized these weren't just strangers. They were mirrors reflecting pieces of his own life. Halfway through, Christopher's voice boomed from the front, cutting through the low murmur of the room. "Jamal, come up here!" Jamal froze, his sneakers squeaking against the floor as every eye turned toward him. His heart thudded, a frantic drumbeat urging him to shrink back, but Christopher's gaze held him steady. "This is my son, Jamal," Christopher announced, his chest puffing slightly as he rested a hand on Jamal's shoulder. "He's the reason I fight as hard as I do. He's got more strength in him than he even knows." Heat rushed to Jamal's face, painting his cheeks red as he ducked his head, but the weight of his father's pride anchored him. He glanced out at the sea of faces, some younger than him, some older, all watching with a quiet intensity, and something clicked. "I didn't feel strong when it happened," he started, his voice shaky at first, barely above a whisper. "I was in that store just trying to get something for my mom, and they looked at me like I was nothing. I was so embarrassed I wanted to disappear. Angry, too, like I could have smashed everything in sight. But my dad, he showed me strength isn't about never being scared or mad. It's about getting up anyway, about saying something even when your voice shakes." The room erupted, hands clapping, voices whooping, a wave of sound that crashed over Jamal and left him breathless. For the first time, the knot of pain he'd carried since that day loosened, unraveling into something bigger, a purpose that stretched beyond himself. He wasn't just a kid who'd been wronged. He was part of a chorus, a story that could lift others up. Months later, a package arrived at their weathered front door, the cardboard slightly dented from its journey. Jamal retrieved it, his fingers brushing over the return address, a store he hadn't stepped foot in since that humiliating afternoon. Inside was the watch he'd once dreamed of buying for his mom, its silver band glinting under the kitchen light, accompanied by a letter scrawled in the careful hand of the new manager. "We're sorry," it read, the words simple but heavy with intent. Jamal's stomach twisted as he carried it to his mom, her silhouette framed by the soft glow of the living room lamp. "It's not the same," he murmured, handing her the box, his voice thick with the residue of old wounds. She lifted the lid, her breath catching as she traced the watch's face with trembling fingers. Tears welled in her eyes, spilling over as she pulled him into a hug that smelled of lavender and home. "No," she whispered against his shoulder. "It's better." "Because it came from you." As the days stretched into weeks, Jamal found his rhythm again, the jagged edges of his life smoothing out with time. He started journaling, his pen scratching across the pages of a battered notebook late into the night. The words poured out, raw, jagged, beautiful, capturing the storm of his thoughts in a way that felt like exhaling after holding his breath too long. One afternoon, Christopher spotted the notebook abandoned on the coffee table, its pages splayed open like an invitation. He picked it up, his calloused fingers flipping through the entries, a slow smile spreading across his face. "These are good, Jamal," he said, holding it up like a trophy. "Really good." Jamal shrugged, shoving his hands into his pockets, the compliment landing awkwardly on his shoulders. "It's just stuff I've been thinking about," he mumbled. "You should share it," Christopher urged, his voice brimming with conviction. "People need to hear what you've got to say. Your voice. It's got power." Jamal chewed his lip, the idea flickering like a candle in the wind. "Maybe someday," he said finally, and Christopher's smile widened, patient but certain. "Take your time. But don't you ever doubt that what's in here," he tapped the notebook, "matters." Years later, Jamal would look back on that day in the store not as the moment that broke him, but as the spark that set him ablaze. It wasn't just about him or his family. It was the beginning of a journey that taught him the depth of his own resilience, the quiet force he could wield to nudge the world forward. The change didn't come in a grand, sweeping rush. It crept in through the cracks. Conversations that lingered, young faces at events who sought him out to say his words had steadied them. The way he walked with a confidence that had once felt foreign. The fight, he realized, wasn't just about righting a single wrong. It was about dismantling the machinery of power that crushed people under its weight, about forging a world where no one would have to prove their worth just to breathe. And that, Jamal knew as he stood taller with each step, was a legacy worth building, one slow, deliberate push at a time.